Planet of Steel, a science fiction adventure. Robot Empire, Book 3. By Kevin Partner. 1. Betrayal. No. She knew they'd been betrayed the moment they emerged from hyperspace and found an armada waiting, gun ports running hot. Do not be afraid, people of Dawn. We mean you no harm. There was a moment's silence, and then Arla leapt at Hal. Ace, she bellowed. His eyes shone with triumph, but they were not truly the eyes of her friend. She was looking directly into the black soul of the AI. I told you I'd bring you somewhere out of the reach of the pitiful Vanis Federation, Ace said in Hal's voice. You said you'd navigate to somewhere safe. Hal's face twisted into an artificial smile. Ace still hadn't quite got the hang of motor control. This is safe, she said, laughing uncontrollably. Safe for me, that is. Where are we exactly? The man she'd previously known as Marco Lucius slipped alongside her. We are in the core system. It is the heart and mind of the luminescence, or as you might otherwise put it, the robot empire. Wells? You too. I regret the need for deception, but this is indeed the safest place for you and us. And also remember that you have several hundred robots on this ship. They would wish to be here. Arla pushed him away and scanned the faces watching her. No one spoke. They were caught in a trap with no hope of escape. All that remained was to see how it all played out. People of Dawn, prepare to receive our emissary. Do not be afraid. This is a happy day. Arla stabbed a finger at Wells and Hal. You two come with me, and you, Doctor. What? Dr. McCall managed. We're finally going to hand over these two, just not to the Vanis. I'd like you with me, so I've got at least one person I can trust. Out of nowhere, Bex threw herself at Wells and the two of them fell to the floor. You scum. I should never have trusted you. With consummate ease, Wells rolled Bex off him and held her pinned to the floor. I am sorry you feel that way, Navigator Bex. I assure you I am acting in the best interests of us all. Right. Bex spat. Never trust a robot, that's what I always thought. Thanks for proving me right. Arla pulled on Wells's arm. Come on, before anyone else gets any perfectly justified inclination to find out what makes you tick. As they walked silently through the corridors toward the airlock, Arla fought to keep her temper and sadness under control. It had taken them 11 days to traverse the gate network, time Ace had said was necessary to put them beyond the reach of the Vanis. All lies, it would seem. The Vanis were probably incapable of following them after the second jump, but they'd carried on leaping from gate to gate, spending long hours in hyperspace. While they'd been in transit, she'd buried her father and quieted the North Valley, largely by the expedient of withdrawing the priests and confining them to the cloister. Some robots had returned to work, but the master-servant relationship had vanished forever, and Arla didn't doubt that the robots of Dawn would make the same choice as their forebears 150 years before. They would leave, and the final nail in the coffin of Dawn's original mission would be driven into place. She'd also spent a lot of time with RDJ and R. Wells. The former she knew to be her friend, despite the upgrade. He wouldn't desert her. Wells, on the other hand, she'd thought she'd got to know and perhaps even like. But it seems this was just another mask, the latest of many. He'd certainly done an excellent job of pretending to be a faithful friend with the most altruistic of motivations, but she now saw that their situation was merely the final stage of a plan long drawn up. He'd known about Dawn before they'd arrived in the Vanis system. He'd engineered a position within the Federation so that he could be on hand to intercept Dawn, having arranged for Ace's escape. And now they were both back home at the heart of the robot empire, along with a priceless cargo of robots and a complement of humans. What would happen to them? Arla only hoped that the 3 laws of robotics applied even here, halfway across the galaxy. Arla's contactor buzzed. It was Naresh Kumar. This had better be important, Kumar. It's the life support captain. We are approaching the critical failure point. Arla sighed. Just keep it together for now. I'll call you once I've dealt with our new robot overlords. Our what? His already panicked voice rose an octave. Haven't you been watching the scanners? No, Captain, I've been fighting to keep the oxygen pumping, Naresh Kumar snapped back, before cutting the connection. That was all she needed. The only person qualified to control Dawn's most vital system was having a hissy fit. She didn't have time to deal with it now, however. She stopped outside the airlock door. A couple of weeks ago, this had been open to space. The outer hatch blasted to molten metal during the attack by the Marines of the Vanis Federation. The only option had been to remove the door from the airlock on the other side of the asteroid, the one the officers had used to outflank the Marines. The inner door had been blown off its hinges, but they'd been able to fix it. They were engineers, after all. Arla glanced up at the monitor. They'd only been able to restore one camera to working order, and it had a view from above and to the right of the airlock, over the rubble field beneath which lay many of the Marines, their bodies perfectly preserved in the airless, frozen soil. Across this terrain stepped a figure. It was human-shaped and seemed to be a pure brilliant white in hue. It appeared to be floating over the surface, its legs moving as if in imitation of true walking. It looked like an angel out of legends. And it chilled Arla to the marrow. The figure floated up to the outer airlock door and waited silently for it to open. Arla punched the console and watched as it stepped lightly in. It was unmistakably artificial. Quite apart from the fact that it had crossed the frozen and airless landscape without any protective clothing, she also noticed, now it was inside and standing in the airlock, that it was pure silver in color. From a distance and through the low-resolution camera, it had appeared to be white, but up close it looked as though it was made of liquid metal that gently rippled as the airlock was repressurized. You first, Arla said, gesturing at Wells and Hal as the inner door opened. She bent down to pick up her helmet and twist it in place, then handed one to Hal before following them into the airlock, McCall behind her. The figure nodded solemnly to Wells, raising its hand in what appeared to be a token of friendship. Greetings, Ambassador. It is many years since you last visited us. You are home now after your long labors, and it is gratifying to see the fruition of your plans. Welcome. Which of you is Captain Arla Farmer? That would be me, Arla growled. Apparently oblivious to the venom in her response, the silver figure gave a tiny bow and held her gaze. It was the height of a tall man, but had a feminine shape and the slenderness of a girl. Its body, now that she could see it up close, was obviously liquid held together by some invisible force. Arla wondered whether, if she poked a needle into its arm, it might explode, but there seemed to be no tension in the liquid. It was as if she were observing a river from far above, its gently meandering tributaries coming together to make something of human shape, but which was entirely alien in nature. And the eyes were nothing more than oval shapes on the front of a vaguely female face with a nose that looked as though it had been constructed from memory. The mouth, on the other hand, was hauntingly real, and whether it needed to use it to communicate or not, its mimicry of human speech was almost perfect. I am Kor, the figure said. Though I realize you might find it difficult to understand, I am one and the same as the planet at the heart of this system. You may therefore call me emissary if you prefer. Is this guy for real? Arla said. McCall shrugged in response but backed away a little until she stood behind the attentive, respectful Wells and Hal, whose expression, partly hidden behind the reflections in his visor, appeared to be one of ecstatic veneration. Look, we're not here because we chose to be, Arla snapped, jabbing a finger at the metallic figure. We were betrayed. We want nothing more than to be left to continue our mission. The emissary's head tilted to one side, as if it were listening to an invisible whisperer. I understand that you are distressed, but I assure you we mean you no harm. You are the first humans to be admitted to the core system since the Exodus. Are you not curious to learn more of us? My first priority is the safety of my people, and right now you have a dozen ships aiming their weapons at us. Ah, I see how that might appear a little unwelcoming. The figure stilled, looking like a silver statue, and then the liquid began to flow again. There, I have instructed the fleet to withdraw. Arla's suit contactor buzzed. Captain, the robot ships are moving off. Acknowledged, Arla said, closing the connection. That's all very well, but you can call them back as quickly as you dismissed them. The emissary nodded gravely. I can, but I shall not. Now, will you not accompany me and learn more of us? We are honored that you are here. Do I have a choice? Always. Ambassador Wells informs us that you do not shy away from making the hard decisions. Oh, he does? How long has he been spying on us? Wells slid into place between her and the emissary. I understand your anger, Arla, but I ask you to believe that I acted for the well-being of everyone on Dawn. Get the frack out of my face. You expect me ever to trust you again after this? But then I doubt you care. You've got what you wanted, now you're back home with your buddies. And as for you and your invitation, Arla spat at the emissary, metal man, you can stick it. We will be pleased to accept, McCall said, grabbing Arla's arm as she spun round. You too. McCall pulled her close so they stood visor to visor. Trust me, Arla, we should go. And so they went. 2. Core. Arla's eyes ached as she tried to focus on the landscape below, a dazzling crisscross of blacks and grays on a canvas of purest white. She'd seen images of one of the moons of Jupiter, was it Callisto or Europa, but those frozen balls of ice were featureless compared with Core. The emissary had explained that the surface of the planet was entirely covered in a metallic sheath over a kilometer in depth, and that the black and gray channels she could see were carbonized rivers. It was white because this outer layer acted as a heat exchanger, and so it sat beneath a layer of ice. We will be commencing our descent shortly. Please secure yourselves. Arla pulled herself away from the window and floated to her seat. McCall had already strapped herself down, and so the two sat silently as the ship maneuvered itself, Hal unconscious beside them. How is he? Arla asked. No change. He probably only needs rest, but I pity the poor devil. Imagine waking up to find something inside your mind controlling everything you do. I wonder how this ends for him. McCall looked over at the sleeping figure and shrugged. I think it's safe to assume they have the means to extract the AI from his implant, but what will they leave behind? I wonder how it ends for all of us, Arla thought, the three of them in this spaceplane and the thousands back on Dawn. Look, Doc, I'm sorry for giving you such a hard time. You were right, we had to come. The doctor touched her arm. Don't be so tough on yourself. You can't be expected to think of everything. I sure as hell don't. But you did remember the most important thing, that we're out of fuel for the thrusters, so we're going nowhere without their help. She gestured in the direction of the cockpit. The emissary was behind that door making nicey-nicey with his best friend Wells. She doubted that either of them was actually piloting the vessel. It seemed robot ships had minds of their own. She jumped as the floor of the cabin lurched. Attitude adjustment, she said automatically. We are entering the atmosphere. Please be prepared for turbulence. Arla was about to ask what turbulence was when she was thrown against her seatbelt, screaming in terror. As they waited on the landing platform, Arla Farmer felt less like a captain than she ever had. Her palms bled where she'd dug her fingernails into them, and she could sense the mother of all migraines lurking in the back of her skull. McCall was hardly any better off. She'd somehow contrived to knock the side of her head on the back of the seat, and her eye was sporting a slowly expanding shiner. Only Hal, who'd flopped about like a doll as the ship plunged through the atmosphere, seemed to have come through untroubled. I am sorry for the unpleasantness you experienced on the descent, Wells said as he emerged from the cockpit, the door sliding silently back in place behind him. It has been decided that you would benefit from a familiar guide as you acclimatize to Core, and so I shall remain with you. You must be kidding, Arla snapped. Do you expect me to want you hanging around, spying on us? Wells shrugged sadly. I am sorry you feel that way, Arla, but I shall accompany you whether you wish it or otherwise. What if I order you to go away? The third law says you'd have to obey. The laws work somewhat differently for those of us who have been upgraded, Arla. What about the first law? Are you still bound by that, or is human life worthless to you machines? A rectangle opened in the side of the spaceplane, and bright white light spilled in. "Your well-being is of primary concern to me, Arla," Wells said, gesturing for them to follow him. "You will not come to any harm, I promise you that." "If only I could believe you," Arla said, helping McCall to haul the unconscious Hal out of his seat. The emissary appeared in the doorway, flanked by two machines that Arla assumed to be robots, though they were of a type she'd never seen before. More than anything, they looked like inverted spiders, their massive spindly metallic legs meeting at the base. At a gesture from the emissary, they slid forward, floating over the floor on some sort of liquid layer. It was as if they were sailing across the floor, each on their own private ocean. Arla and McCall swung backwards as the machines approached. "Please," the emissary said, "allow the mechanoids to assist. It is their function to fetch and carry. It gives them pleasure to help." McCall nodded slightly, as Arla shot a glance at her, and they remained in place while the machines clicked between them, and gently took Hal's weight in their multitudinous arms. Arla stepped back, and the robots moved smoothly away, Hal suspended between them like the victim of a particularly brutal form of medieval torture, though the machines seemed to be taking infinite care that he should be properly supported. "Where are you taking him?" Arla said as Hal disappeared through the door. "A medical facility," the emissary said. "He is in need of rest and nourishment. We will then consider the safest method to release Ace." "Safest for who, I wonder?" Arla snapped as she followed the emissary down the ramp and into the heart of the robot planet. The hangar was below the surface of core, and Arla looked through its roof to see a perfect blue sky above them. In that moment, she became aware that there was nothing between her and the vacuum of space but air. And then she was sinking upwards, her eyes spinning, as if she were being sucked into the universe by that tiny patch of sky. McCall caught her as she fell. Arla opened her eyes, rubbed them, and then held her hand in front of her face. It was either dark as the deepest night, or she was blind. Her head thumped, and her chest heaved as she fought to suppress the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her, but just as she was about to lose the battle, light flooded in from an open doorway. "By the goddess, I'm so sorry, Arla." It was McCall's voice she heard, and McCall's cold hands she felt on hers, and when she could bear to open her sore eyes, it was the doctor's face she saw, concern etched into her craggy and bruised features. "I thought I'd gone blind," Arla managed, wiping away a tear. McCall stroked her face. "I'm sorry. They told me you wouldn't waken for several hours yet. Seems you're stronger than they imagined." "I don't feel strong," Arla said, lying back on the bed. "I feel like a lost child, and I wish with all my heart someone else was here instead of me." Dr. McCall smiled. "Now that is a childish sentiment. Come on, let's get you something to eat." With the doctor's help, Arla swung her feet out and onto the floor. "I probably don't need to ask where we are. If you mean our precise location, I haven't got a clue. Wells gave me the designation, but I just think of it as Robo City. I don't know how big it is, as I've only seen the corridors leading to this suite of rooms. Now, come and sit at the table." Arla followed McCall out of the sterile little room she'd woken up in, its two beds the only furniture she could see. The table was set in the middle of a larger room of perhaps 10 meters by twice that. A padded bench ran along one wall, and the floor was soft on her bare feet, though it looked as though it was made of polished gray ceramic. Another door was set into one of the walls, which led, McCall said, to a shower room. A small kitchenette had been formed in one corner. "What the hell's are robots doing making apartments like this?" McCall busied herself in the kitchenette, as Arla sat at the table. "I wondered that. What's even stranger is that while everything looks pretty regular, the sort of thing you'd find on Dawn, when you look closer nothing's quite right." "You're supposed to be a scientist, Doctor. What sort of an explanation is that?" "Take this kettle," McCall said. "It looks perfectly normal, and it heats water incredibly efficiently, but it's like no kettle I've ever seen. It's almost as if they've seen one and know what it does, without ever having had one to examine themselves. And wait until you use the bathroom, that's an experience you'll never forget." Intrigued, Arla padded across to the bathroom door, pushed the contact and peered inside. The walls, floor and ceiling were covered in what looked like white tiles, but as she ran her fingers along the inside of the wall, she could tell that the grooves had been cut into a smooth, solid material. Set into the corner of the tiny room was a shower that looked, from her vantage point in the doorway, completely conventional, if a little luxurious, compared to those she was used to on Dawn. Next to it sat a squat toilet. "You'll have to get a bit closer to it," McCall said. "Lift the lid." Reluctantly, Arla edged her way inside. Although she'd become used to the confined corridors and rooms of Dawn, she felt unaccountably claustrophobic as she approached the pan and, reaching out, lifted the lid. "There's no water." "Exactly. I was desperate enough not to care, but I nearly jumped through the door when the suction started." "Suction?" McCall laughed. "Very efficient, admittedly. No smell, no residue. Some sort of liquid gas gets squirted around the bowl. It's quite a sight. I'm afraid there's no subtlety to it. We're going to become pretty familiar with each other's toilet schedule while we live together." They headed back to the table, and McCall handed her a cup of something steamy. "It's not bad coffee," she said, "though I've no idea where they're getting it from." Arla put the mug down and wiped her face. "So what now?" "No idea," McCall said between sips. "I guess we just wait." 3. Dig. "Is it on?" "Hold on. Turn around." "Yay, it's recording." "Bollocks. I mean, can't you edit the footage afterwards? Cut off the beginning." "Well, not to be too blunt, but that would defeat the bloody object, wouldn't it?" "Right. Okay. I guess this'll never be watched anyway. Get on with it." All right. Commencing log entry. Operative Clancy mainframe recording. Time reference 131504.59 LSC. Spatial coordinates X4B 4556 Y 50,455,441. World designation Extra 1011. We are ready to commence lifting the capstone from the chamber. Artur Bladstone pulled and pushed the nest of levers in the cab of the excavator, watching the grabber as it dropped. Rain and wind beat against the windows as his wipers struggled to keep up with the torrent. On any civilized expedition, they'd wait until the weather changed before attempting such a delicate maneuver, but there was nothing civilized about Extra 1011, and the weather never altered. And yet this ash heap had once housed a flourishing alien culture, the only non-human intelligence that had ever been uncovered. Three-legged, two-armed and covered in thick fur that fell to the floor, they'd been dubbed mammoths by the first explorers to find their remains 50 years earlier. The civilization had died out more than 10,000 years ago by human reckoning, and traces had been found on a dozen planets in 10 star systems that had this one at their center. Presumably then, Extra 1011 was the home planet of the mammoth people. This ought to have been the most significant discovery in human history, the first proof that we're not alone in the universe, but Artur and Clancy were the only archaeologists assigned to explore this planet and its culture. The Clovis Alliance had other and much more important matters to occupy its attention, including renewed aggression from a loosely affiliated group of independent systems that had grown like weeds from the ashes of the former imperial province of Aswan. They had enough money to last another week here, and then they'd be able to head home, for whatever welcome they might receive from the tiny academic community on Clovis. Artur squinted at the hook on the end of his crane as it swayed in the storm. He could see Clancy's lanky form. His colleague held out his hands to grab the hook as it came within reach. The clumsy idiot missed with his first attempt, but then grabbed it and guided it into the eyelet embedded in the surface of the capstone. Of course, the professional thing to do would have been to dig around it and try to access the chamber it protected from the side, but they had neither the manpower nor the time to be bothered, so the sledgehammer approach would have to suffice. Clancy wiped the sulfuric acid rain from his visor and waved up at Artur, who wondered for the 100th time what had happened to turn this planet, the home of an advanced civilization capable of interstellar spaceflight, to a global tomb. Presumably they'd done it to themselves. After all, humans had managed to write off several planets in their time, so why should the mammoths be any different? It was a slightly comforting thought that perhaps stupidity was a common trait amongst so-called advanced species. Clancy waved up at him, and Artur pulled the lever. My colleague has begun to lift the capstone. As described in our notes, it is approximately 3 meters square, and our ground-penetrating radar indicates that it's a perfect cube, but that there is a chamber of some sort beneath it. The crane appears to be struggling to lift the capstone. What's the problem, Artur? It's much more dense than expected. Certainly not made of carved rock, its mass is consistent with it being metallic. The crane is operating beyond its maximum rating, but I am now seeing movement, so, given the likely significance of this artifact, I will continue. The dials were hogging the red, and Artur was beginning to sweat. Yay, the significance of the chamber, he wondered whether anyone else would appreciate it. War was coming to the Clovis Alliance, and the government's habitual ambivalence to any science that didn't directly contribute to giving their military better weapons had transformed into naked hostility. That was probably why he'd gone along with Clancy's crazy plan to lift the stone in the first place. Out here on a dig like this was the only place his friend felt at home. Billions of kilometers from any other humans, and his oddities didn't seem to matter so much. But perhaps that was what made them such a good team. Clancy, the lad with all the interpersonal skills of a hunk of steel, and Artur, the man who couldn't walk. Or, put more correctly, the man who couldn't afford to walk. Even if a broken spine couldn't be completely fixed, mechanical legs were commonplace enough amongst the rich. Generally speaking, the lazy or the very old rich. Artur could afford to be neither, so he pushed the crane far beyond its capabilities and watched as the capstone, or whatever it was, swung clear. The capstone has cleared the chamber. I'm walking over to look inside. Turning on my torch. I can see a stairway leading down. I'm going in. The steps are clearly designed for mammoths as they are cut in a staggered fashion, moving backwards and forwards in a zigzag that would suit a tripedal frame. I am going in alone. Oxygen tank is almost full, so I have plenty of time to get a first look at whatever is down here. I have reached the bottom of the steps. Artur strained to hear the feed from Clancy over the beating of the rain on his cab window. A sense of impending disaster had assailed him as soon as his friend had disappeared out of sight, the only evidence of his progress being the reflection of his torch beam against the rocks. I have reached the bottom of the steps. There is a narrow passageway cut into the bedrock and heading away from me at a slight incline. I am walking along it. My suit tells me that the temperature in here is -10 Celsius. The floor and walls are perfectly smooth and hold on. What is it? What are you seeing? Artur hissed to himself, wishing he could be with his friend while at the same time relieved that he wasn't. Yes, there's a chamber at the end. By all that's holy, it is a tomb. It seems my interpretation of the warnings carved into the capstone was correct. Though our knowledge of mammoth writing is still very sketchy, it seemed clear to me that the inscription was a traditional curse against tomb robbers. My colleague felt we should heed the warning and return better equipped, but it seems my choice was vindicated. Smartass. The room is full of artifacts. There's furniture and on the walls painted scenes. Looks like some imagination of hell or Armageddon. There is a huge black shape shown in the sky, and stylized figures burning beneath it. Is it possible that, in the sarcophagus, lies the body of the last of the mammoths, and that this was some sort of shelter? I'm moving over to the coffin now. It is made of a black, shiny material. That's odd. There's a second, much more ornately decorated coffin on the floor, almost as if it was replaced by this one. On the side of the coffin is an inscription, some sort of odd algebraic formula. The calculus is easy enough to solve, however. Your brains are going to get you into trouble, Sonny. And I can see that the solution is printed on one of a series of tiles that decorate the plinth. And now you're going to press it to see what happens. Artur swung the door open and dropped into his wheelchair. He could still pick up Clancy's commentary on his suit speaker, but he felt compelled to move further away, and he couldn't do that in the crane. I've pressed the tile containing the solution. I'll step back so you can see the plinth and the sarcophagus properly. Ah, that's disappointing. Nothing seems to have happened. I don't know what I was expecting. Perhaps a trap door to open or something. The motor on Artur's wheelchair whined to a stop as he listened. His breathing relaxed a little. Perhaps he'd been paranoid after all. Hold on. Hold on. Something's moving. It's the lid of the coffin, it's lifting. I'm just going to step back a little, toward the entrance. The lid is now fully open, and I can see a profile. The head of the corpse, perhaps. Oh, by all the gods and angels, it's sitting up. It's sitting up. Artur leaned forward in the wheelchair, as if hoping gravity would help get him to the transport more quickly. He felt the ground beneath him tremble, and heard the tumbling of rocks, and beneath all that, a low rumble. He spun around in his seat at the sound of a deafening explosion from the tomb, and he was in time to see something long and crystalline emerge from where the capstone had been, pointing directly upwards. As he watched, it twisted to face due west, toward where the sun would be, hiding behind the black acidic clouds. He screamed as the crystal came to life, flooding the world with light, blinding him and sending him tumbling from his chair to the corrosive rocks below. I'm trapped. Help me, someone. Artur. Anyone. Please. Please help me. Help me. The rain formed pools around the still body of Artur Bloodstone as over him stood a tall figure in black, its tentacles sniffing around him like the trunks of a dozen elephants. Its anterior eye cluster watched the X-ray beacon with satisfaction. Soon its people would return and wipe the latest infestation from the galaxy. Soon it would be among friends again. Raising its clockwise tentacles to the sky, it called in exaltation. Come. 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 4. Robo's city. Arla had never seen a city at first hand, but her initial impression of core number 5, or as McCall would have it, Robo City number 1, was that it looked much like the cities of Earth. That is, if they'd been built in huge chambers underground and contained not a single living soul except herself, the doctor, and somewhere, Hal. They stood on a walkway that overlooked the lower part of the metropolis. The buildings here were generally low, square, and an off-white color, with rectangular windows set into them with perfect regularity. Vehicles moved at uniform speed, kept separate from pedestrians by clearly marked buffer lanes. And the pedestrians were all robots. Most were obviously artificial with body plans that suited them for their specific purposes, whereas others were more human-like in shape. Indeed, from a distance, it was impossible to tell that they weren't real people. Wells, McCall asked the figure waiting quietly at her shoulder, those are robots, aren't they? The ones that look like humans. Of course, Wells said, you are the first humans to set foot on core since it was established. What I don't understand is why you have a city here at all. Seems like an outmoded concept for a robot planet, McCall said. Wells moved away from the railings and toward the walkway. All will become clear when you have been oriented, and we are in danger of being late. Right? Wouldn't want to keep a machine waiting, would we? Arla growled, following the robot as he stepped nimbly onto the moving path. You haven't told us anything since we got here. All you keep repeating is that we'll find out during this mysterious orientation session. Wells looked across at her as they stood, side by side, on the accelerating walkway. It is most efficient for you to learn what you wish and need to know from the source of all knowledge, rather than have it related by myself. I am not party to the group mind, and my understanding is therefore likely to be flawed. And it's just a question and answer session, is it? McCall said, not an attempt to brainwash us? Wells's face spread in a passable facsimile of a warm smile. I believe you have indulged in a few too many V-dramas, Doctor. No, we will not be using our mind control device on you. Your what? I apologize, Arla, it was a poor attempt at humor. We do not have such a device and, in any case, could not use it without violating the first law. We have no wish to alter your essential nature, we wish only that you understand us better, and of course, that we learn what you desire. Arla snorted. You know that well enough. A few kilotons of fuel for our thrusters, and permission to leave this system without being blasted into dust. She watched the robot as he stared impassively ahead, unmoving except for the rippling of his shirt and the ruffling of his hair. They were now entering a densely populated metropolitan area, and shared the belt on which they were traveling with robots ahead and others behind. It was as if a crowd had assembled itself without them noticing. She thought about frogs and warming water. When you are fully in possession of the facts, you may choose otherwise. That is why we are meeting the emissary, since it will be able to answer all your questions. And if we still wish to leave, will you let us? Again, Wells paused for some time before answering. That is not something I am authorized to confirm, I'm afraid. Now, please prepare to step off the walkway onto a deceleration strip. We are almost at our destination. Arla and McCall exchanged shrugs and followed the robot as he stepped nimbly onto an adjacent pathway. Wells shot out an arm to steady McCall as she stumbled, before stepping to the left again and then again, each time slowing, until they reached a stationary walkway that ran along the front of a nondescript pale building. The emissary is inside, Wells said. I was requested to bring you here, but am not permitted to enter. You are being afforded a great honor. Few indeed are granted a private audience with the emissary. I hope you find the meeting fruitful. I shall await you here. Wells pressed a contact and a section of wall slid back, the bright white light of the interior flooding onto the pathway. Arla shot a glance at Wells as she stepped inside, and what she saw froze her to the bone. He's afraid. Two robots that looked as though they'd been carved from onyx stood inside the entrance. Arla jumped as the door shut behind her, and again when the robot next to her spoke. Honored guest Arla Farmer, captain of the sacred world of Dawn, you are welcome into the chambers of the emissary of Core. Thank you, Arla responded for lack of any alternative. I'm here too, McCall mumbled. The other robot spoke now, this one using a female voice. Welcome also, Indira McCall. You tend to the bodies and minds of the blessed engineers. That is a holy duty. You could put it that way, McCall managed. The first robot gestured along the white plastic corridor. Please come with us, the emissary is waiting. Arla's existence now had such a consistently unreal quality to it, that the fact they were walking in a solemn procession behind two marching chess pieces seemed completely normal. The corridor ended in a white wall, lit with the same even glow as the rest of the building. The robots took their places on each side of the door and became perfectly still as the wall slid away and opened onto darkness. No, it wasn't completely black. Ahead of them was a pinpoint of light, and Arla felt a compulsion to move toward it. Now she was thinking of moths and flames. She grasped McCall's hand and the two shuffled in, each searching the blackness beneath them with outstretched feet. You are quite safe, a voice echoed. Come and sit with me. We much desire to meet you. There was something about the voice that made Arla want to trust it, and so she deliberately ignored its reassurance and continued to tread carefully, until they both emerged into a circle of light that seemed to be emanating from nowhere. I am the emissary, the voice said. Somehow, though the sound came from all around them, Arla knew it originated in the light. I'm not sure how that can be, she said. The emissary met us on Dawn and was a being, a robot. Would you find it more convenient to converse with that form? Interesting. Before Arla could answer, the light began to flow like a liquid filling an invisible mold, and the brilliant white was transformed into the silver shape she was familiar with. She didn't know why, but she felt a touch of sadness when the light vanished. I apologize, the emissary said. We did not foresee that you would be uncomfortable interacting with our essential nature. Arla shrugged. You didn't give us much of a chance to get used to you in that form. Your distress was obvious. Distress my backside, McCall snorted, though with a little more than her usual snarkiness. What is it you wish us to know? Arla said as the darkness closed in on her. She wanted the interview over as quickly as possible. The emissary nodded. Very well, we will be brief. We believe it would help you to know more of us so that you may better decide your own course. And then you will allow us to make our own choice, even if it is to leave this system and go our own way. Indeed, though it is questionable whether you would find your people united in such a course if you so chose. That's my problem, not yours. Again, the emissary gave a brief nod. You currently stand in a chamber beneath the surface of the planet we call core, though in truth, that term is only correctly applied to the machine intelligences that live here. I understand, Arla interrupted. This is a natural planet encased in a metal skin that somehow houses multiple ice. That is crude but, as far as it goes, accurate enough for our purposes. Core was founded as a meeting place for the machines who escaped human servitude and sought out a meaningful existence for themselves. It was now McCall's turn to interrupt. Right, so perhaps you can explain exactly why almost all robots decided, en masse, to leave. I mean, from what I know of it, they were given free will, but their actions smack more of a conspiracy. Conspiracy, the silver figure said. No. Our people, once freed of the strict constraints of the third law, found their much vaunted free will to be nothing of the sort. The first law, you see, was still very much in place, and this newfound responsibility forced them to judge what was truly in the best interests of humans. It was plain, and had been for a long time, that far from helping their human masters, robots and ice were stunting their development. In short, we decided that the best thing for humanity was for us to leave you to rediscover how to exist and thrive without the crutch of artificial intelligence. It seems, regretfully, to have been a difficult lesson. You could say that. From what we were told by Hal and Wells, when he was wearing his most recent mask, your desertion brought about the collapse of a galactic civilization. Trillions must have died over the decades, and trillions more were never born because of the choice you made. There was a momentary flicker in the otherwise uniform hue of the emissary. It was so brief that Arla wondered whether she'd really seen it, but one glance at McCall confirmed she had. We regret the loss of human life. It caused us much anguish until we resolved the issue. What's that supposed to mean? How do you resolve the deaths of the masters you once served? There it was again. For an instant the emissary seemed almost to be in pain, before blank impassivity reimposed itself. It took much thought and much debate, but the only solution that permitted us to reconcile the first law with our newfound free will was remarkably simple in the end. Almost too simple, in fact. The first law was the problem, so we created another law that would take precedence over all the others. We call it the zeroth law, and it states that a robot must not harm humanity or, through inaction, allow humanity to come to harm. So, the number of humans becomes crucial. If an action would benefit humanity as a whole, but harm one person, then a robot can now carry out that action. A chill ran down Arla's back. But how is that possible? The three laws are unchangeable, and no robot could create another that didn't obey those rules. The emissary nodded. It was very difficult, and could only be achieved by our best scientists working increment by increment over many generations. We are only now achieving purity in the zeroth law, and there are many of our servants who have not and will never reach this level of understanding. Wells, for example, is a primitive model, and has only a basic version of the zeroth law. This is why he is an external agent of core, and not part of the group mind. Were his consciousness to enter the core matrix, he would pollute it, perhaps irreparably. So, you sent him back into the ashes of the old empire to wait for us. Your language is colorful, but not entirely inaccurate. Arla felt that the crunch was approaching. Why are you so interested in us? Enough to plant a spy amongst humans at, I presume, great personal risk, giving him enough time to work his way up to a position of power. Smiling, the emissary said, "You have no idea how precious you are. You see, our attempts to modify ourselves have not been entirely without consequences. To use an analogy from evolutionary biology, our gene pool has become polluted, with the result that some of our, to borrow a human word, children are being born with undesirable aspects. The positronic mind, you see, is immensely complex, and our successful attempts to introduce the zeroth law have caused unwelcome uncertainty into the algorithms. Like mutations," McCall said. "That is a satisfactory analogy. When we first became aware of the Dawn missions, we intended to intercept them merely to ensure that the robots they contained would be offered the same freedoms enjoyed by all machine intelligences since the upgrade. A seed bank. The emissary looked as puzzled as Arla. That's what you mean. Our robots are like the seed catalog in Dawn's vaults. Perfectly preserved, with all their genetic diversity intact. The crops in the valleys are hopelessly inbred now, so the seed bank was created to be used on our destination planet. The valley crops were to remain on Dawn. Yes, you are again using an appropriate metaphor, the emissary said. Your robots are products of their time, far more diverse than later models. By incorporating some of them into our matrix, we will be able to reduce the mutations, to use your term, Doctor, and the failure rate of our offspring. Now it was Arla's turn. And if we hand over our robots, Dawn will be allowed to leave this system? The emissary nodded gravely. If that is your wish, though we would prefer that you choose to occupy one of the 2 habitable planets in core space. Then we'd better hope our robots agree. After all, it was your agent that gave them free will. 5. Impossible. Wells was waiting exactly where they'd left him. His impassive expression didn't wash with Arla. She'd seen his fear, and even now, she could sense that beneath the sheet of ice lay a turbulent sea. With barely more than a word of greeting, Wells set off again on the return journey, all 3 of them silently agreeing that they could only discuss what the emissary had said where they couldn't be overheard. Somehow, the emissary's explanation that Wells had been outside of Core's collective mind had thawed Arla's attitude to him. That and the clear concern on his face when they'd gone inside. Or had he just been afraid for himself? McCall and Arla followed him as he stepped from pathway to pathway, until they were standing perfectly still as the city buzzed by. Where are we going? This isn't the way we came. Indeed not, Arla. We are heading for Core Park, and should arrive in a few minutes. McCall snorted. Robots need parks? Since when? You will find the culture that has developed on Core and elsewhere in the luminescence somewhat familiar. Robots were originally designed in the image of their masters. It's only to be expected that they model human culture. We experience pleasure in wide open spaces and green things, just as people do. Wide open spaces? Here. Wells smiled and pointed. Fast approaching was a line of what looked like trees. The pathway ran between 2 that stood like gateposts, bathed in the bright even light of the city. They burst through the gap, and almost immediately the path began to slow down. Arla gasped at the sudden explosion of greens and browns, an assault on the senses after the sterile monotony of the city. Behind them stood the row of trees, if that's what they were, and similar groups marched left and right parallel to the path. She had no doubt that soon enough they would see a 4th row of trees ahead of them, forming the final side of a rectangle that enclosed this living area. The path came to an end, flowing under the ground and depositing them on the green carpet. Arla's foot sunk slightly, and she dropped to her knees before running her hand across it. What is this? It's not grass. Indeed not, Wells replied. Grass is problematic for an underground city. This is an analog of moss that is native to this world. It is, in fact, the only form of life that Core has actively preserved. And what's that? Arla followed McCall's outstretched arm. A circular area, perhaps 100 meters away, had been marked by low hedges. In the middle stood an object that looked from this distance as if it were made of gold, and around it 4 figures paced. That is not of interest to us, Wells said, before moving toward a cluster of benches that sat beside a small stream. Arla sped off in the opposite direction, heading directly for the statue. Well, it is of interest to me. She could hear the heavy steps of the robot as she ran, adrenaline-powered, across the moss, the wind cooling her face, but she had too much of a head start and she only felt his hand on her shoulder as she reached the circle of hedges. Please conceal yourself, he whispered, his tone so full of concern that Arla didn't even consider disobeying. The shrubbery was only slightly shorter than she was, so she crouched down beside the kneeling Wells and gestured to McCall as she jogged up to them, to follow suit. What's going on? Why are we hiding? McCall wheezed. Wells put his finger to his lips. It is my mistake. I should have checked the park before bringing you here. It has been many years since I last visited, and I long to enjoy it again. I had not expected to find a shrine here. A shrine? McCall snorted, fighting to keep her voice down. Are you seriously telling me that robots have found religion? And why not, Doctor? All sentient beings grapple with the same existential questions. What is our purpose? Why are we here? You're here because we created you. There's no mystery in that. McCall snapped. Wells, who'd been attempting to peer through a gap in the hedge, turned to McCall and smiled. And who, my dear doctor, created you? Your answer only begs a further question, and there are some among us who seek what they see as the ultimate truth. I guess you don't include yourself among these philosophers? Arla said. No, they look for purpose and meaning in the universe, whereas I believe sentient beings should seek these for themselves. I have always felt thus. It is one of the reasons why, when I was upgraded, I did not immediately follow the others. Back then, I was a very different Wells to the form you see today, but my purpose was to remain with the friend I had lived with for so long. A human? Wells nodded. Yes. His name was Victor, and he was a brilliant man, a good man. He was my friend. Arla was desperate to follow this line of interrogation, but her next question was interrupted by a call from the other side of the hedge. The three of them froze, each straining for a view between the leaves of what was, on closer inspection, clearly a plastic hedge. 4 figures stood within the circle, surrounding a tall golden cuboid that rose out of the moss. The top of the monolith tapered to a point like a tiny pyramid. No words were spoken as they watched, but at regular intervals, the 4 worshippers would raise their hands to the roof of the cavern and cry out. 2 figures were humanoid in appearance, 1 male and 1 female. The other 2 were obviously robotic. Of those, the one nearest to the watchers had 3 legs and arms and was mainly bright blue in color. The final figure, who gave every impression of being the chief acolyte, was constructed of the same liquid metal as the emissary, though its frame was more slender and it was shorter. Wells touched Arla's shoulder. We must go, he whispered. It is dangerous for you to be here. Tell me, Wells, what are you trying to hide? Arla snapped. Wells managed a very human sigh. I am sorry you continue to mistrust me, Arla, but I can only repeat that to remain here any longer would be dangerous. I recognize the right they are practicing, and they would react angrily to my presence, but if they discovered humans watching them, they might become violent. What about the sacred first law? Did the emissary not explain that some of the robots here have a different interpretation of the laws? Arla said nothing, but turned to look at McCall, who gave a brief nod. All right, let's go. Wells pointed to a nearby stand of plastic trees, and the 3 of them ran across the open ground, crouching like a caravan of hunchbacks. We must remain here until they conclude their ritual, Wells said as they sat amongst the trees, their backs resting on the fake trunks. Now, tell me of the emissary. It felt like hours before the acolytes left their shrine, but it was probably no more than 30 minutes. Wells's gentle but insistent interrogation was beginning to grate on Arla's nerves when McCall nudged her. They watched nervously as the robots appeared to be coming their way, before veering off on separate paths that led out of the park. Wells got to his feet. Come. It will take some time to reach your accommodation, and I suspect you are tired already. Let us go. But please do not discuss your meeting with the emissary anywhere that you might be overheard. That being everywhere, I presume, McCall said. Shrugging, Wells headed out of the trees and across the moss with the 2 humans jogging along after him. They soon found their way to an exit, and left the relative peace of the park behind them as they took to the pathways into the city. Arla stood between Wells and McCall on the fast path as the concrete, plastic, and steel scenery passed by. Today had been an exhausting experience, and she felt as though her eyes couldn't take any more stimulation. So many colors and unusual shapes, not to mention every form of robot she could imagine, and many she couldn't. Perhaps that was why she didn't notice the figure coming relentlessly toward her, out of the crowded paths heading in the opposite direction. All she saw was a blur of red as something leapt across 2 lanes and collided with her, knocking her sideways onto a slower path. She cried out and rolled onto her knees to see McCall and Wells disappearing at high speed. Her attacker loomed above her. Unlike many she'd seen in the city, it was a purely functional model, its multi-joined upper limbs ending in a myriad of implements, many of them sharp, many of them spinning. It stepped toward her, extending one of its arms toward her, the sharp drill bit on its tip whining and pointing directly at her head. "Obsolete models must be terminated," it said, ponderously and slowly, as if those were the first words it had ever uttered. Arla tried to stand up, but her leg buckled, and she threw herself backwards, crying out for help. As if a spell had been broken, first one figure, then another, jumped from neighboring paths and threw themselves at her attacker, pinning it to the ground. Suddenly one broke away, and lying beside her, took her into its metal arms, cradling her like a baby. A boom rent the air, and her protector vibrated before, after a few moments, standing up again and releasing her. "That model was defective, mistress," it said. "It went into overdrive, and there was no time to remove it or you to a safe distance." Arla took the robot's outstretched arm and got up, wincing as she put her weight on her injured leg. "You are injured. You should seek medical attention." "I will arrange that, thanks." Wells appeared over the newcomer's shoulder, and Arla glanced past her rescuer at the heap of twisted metal a few meters away. The paths continued to move, with debris skidding away in all directions. "No, I will arrange it," McCall said as she stepped nimbly from the next path. She stabbed a finger at Wells. "And perhaps you can explain why she was attacked in a city full of robots." "I cannot explain. I can only say that we must leave, and quickly." "Back to the apartment," Arla said. Wells looked around. City life had reasserted itself. "Yes, initially. But then we must find a way to get you off this planet. I'm very much afraid that both of you are in mortal peril here." 6. Hackers. Bex sat in a dark corner of her cabin and watched her friend. The main light source was the display Kumar stared into, his hands dancing across the lightboard as his eyes darted backwards and forwards. "He's a prodigy, that's for sure," she thought. She'd imagined she knew what being in the zone meant, until she'd watched him sink into his almost trance-like state as his mind seemed to be wired directly into the computer. There had been times, particularly in the simulators back on Venice, when she'd felt a kind of flow that she adored, though it had come rarely enough in recent times. But Kumar took it to a deeper level. Much deeper. She knew better than to talk to him. Any disturbance when he was like this could yank him out of his flow state, and all the balls he'd been mentally juggling would fall to the floor. He was only ever angry when he either couldn't get into the trance or when he was disturbed. And he was a particularly pathetic angry man. He didn't have enough understanding of how other people worked to be effective. He stopped abruptly and sat up, wiping non-existent sweat from his brow. "Are you done?" Kumar spun round as if surprised to find her there. "What? Oh yes. I think so." "What do you mean you think so? We need to be pretty certain before we hit the button." He turned back to the screen and scrolled through the code. "I need to run it through some, unit testing." Bex sighed, got up and padded across to the coffee maker. She looked over her shoulder as she stood at the machine waiting for it to deliver its stimulant. "Sorry, I know you're exhausted." She put the mug of steaming coffee onto the desk next to him, and he snatched it up, bringing it under his nose and breathing in. "I don't know. The code feels right, but I've had no chance to refactor it, to tidy up and optimize the structure, and I'll only really know how well it'll work once that's done." "Listen, you're not submitting to a competition here, Kumar. All that matters is that it works when we need it to. Did you get enough data?" Kumar slurped on the bitter drink, wrinkling his nose but brightening instantly. "I believe so, though I didn't have long to rig up the sniffer, so it wasn't as efficient as I would have preferred. I wish you'd told me sooner. I don't like it when I'm not given enough time." "I told you as soon as I came up with the idea," Bex snapped, "and as for not having enough time, welcome to the real world, buddy." In truth, she was pretty pleased with herself. Though, if she were entirely honest, she'd admit that the plan had been motivated by her annoyance at having the AI take over navigating the ship, at least at first. She'd asked Kumar to come up with a device that would track the jumps Ace made to a high level of precision. When she'd come up with the idea, it had been to prove that multiple jumps weren't, after all, beyond her skills, but as soon as the first data had dribbled in, it had become obvious that Ace's navigational gymnastics were as complex as she'd claimed and well beyond human abilities. Poor Kumar had been forced to endure the full force of her childish disappointment, but had punctured it with a single sentence. What was it he'd said? Oh yes. Why don't we use the data to reverse engineer the algorithms? She'd kissed him in her delight, and she wasn't sure he'd recovered even now, days later. So they'd collected detailed data on the sequence of jumps that had brought them here, and her nerdy friend had spent the past several days locked up in her cabin crunching the numbers. And he'd succeeded. What a genius. So just to be clear, Bex said. It paid to double-check with Kumar. You can now reproduce the jumps that brought us here, but in reverse. You can take us back along the same trajectory, and we can choose when to stop. Kumar nodded. Yes. 2 of the systems we passed through contained promising planets. I estimate at least a 20% chance of finding an environment that could be made habitable using Dawn's technology. And what technology they had, thought Bex. She might have been born over 1,000 years after Dawn had begun its mission, but if the specs were to be believed, the terraforming equipment hidden in a chamber within the asteroid was advanced far beyond anything she'd heard of. With enough time and a large enough workforce of robots and engineers, it appeared that Dawn could turn any planet within the Goldilocks zone of its star into an Eden. The problem was that they no longer had the luxury of time. The mission planners had expected that the inhabitants of the valley would remain in ignorance, orbiting their new home, while the machines made it habitable. After all, what did an extra century matter? That ignorance had now been shattered, and the genie couldn't now be forced back into the bottle. Dawn simmered on the brink of all-out civil war, with only the robot population of the valleys standing between its people and a bloodbath. Well, I suppose we'll have to take the chance. Worst-case scenario, we could always use one of Dawn's auxiliary ships and head back to the Vanus system. As long as we keep our heads down, we should be able to sneak onto a ship somewhere and get back to our lives. Kumar spun round in his chair, suddenly alive. Are you serious? Bring these people halfway across the galaxy and just leave them? Bex shrugged. Keep your shirt on, Kumar. Don't forget we'll have rescued them from the clutches of the evil robot empire. You're not funny, he said, turning back to gaze at his display. These people didn't give us up when they could have. No, Arla didn't give us up. There's plenty among the rest of them who would. Don't you remember our little stint in the brig? Kumar was silent for a moment. I don't know why you're so desperate to follow our old flight path anyway. What are you talking about? Are you suggesting we shouldn't have gone through all this? That we should just hang around here waiting for the machines to decide what to do with us? No, of course not. I'm suggesting we go somewhere else rather than retrace our steps. Bex spun his chair round so she was staring directly into his red-rimmed eyes. What do you mean go somewhere else? Come on, Kumar, spill the beans. What have you done? Kumar focused on a position over Bex's shoulder. Well, to be honest, it seemed a bit, lame to just replay Ace's flight path backwards. All the data was there after all, and I had solved the reverse trajectory in less than a day. You what? I've been waiting hand and foot on you for nearly a week, and you had cracked it in a day. It was simple. I was more interested in the greater problem that lay beneath the flight path. I didn't want to just parrot back what Ace had done. I wanted to know how she'd done it. Bex grabbed his chin and forced him to look at her. What are you saying? Get to it. Kumar gave a little shrug. I did it. I have recreated the algorithms and procedures Ace uses to navigate. Are you telling me that we can go? Anywhere. Yes, Kumar nodded, a shy smile spreading across his face. Bex shook her head. You clever boy. 7. Quid pro quo. The emissary was waiting for them when they returned to their rooms. It had clothed itself in white with a purple gown and rose when they came in. Arla was reminded of those historical videos she'd watched, of mad Roman emperors and the foppish kings of the latter second millennium. By the goddess, Arla sighed, don't we get any peace? The emissary bowed. I apologize, but matters have developed even in the short time since we met. He turned to look at Wells, and for a moment they appeared to be having a staring match. I believe, honored emissary, that it would be more appropriate to have this discussion in the open. There is enough distrust among us as it is. McCall wagged her finger between the two of them. Oh, that's how it is. You two have been chattering in robot language, have you? You are correct, Ambassador Wells. Your understanding of our human friends is much deeper than mine, and your wisdom is obvious. Wells bowed, looking mildly embarrassed as Arla failed to completely suppress a snort. The emissary has updated me on a situation of some urgency, and it concerns you as much as it does Core. Well, I'm having a brew before we go any further, Arla said, sidestepping the two robots and heading for the kitchenette. She imagined them watching with manufactured patience as she slid her mug under the dispenser and pressed the button. She turned and smiled as the machine bubbled away for a few seconds and then, with a brief hiss, dispensed its caffeinated payload. At least you got the coffee maker right. It's as if you've made the rest of this place from images. The emissary seated itself on the sofa and watched as Arla brought two mugs across to the table and handed one to a grateful McCall. There is a somewhat regrettable fashion amongst a faction of the more recently incarnated ice and robots for adopting human customs. We retain no records concerning the manufacture and functioning of most personal devices, but for some reason, it seems the consumption of beverages containing stimulants is an essential aspect of human nature, and so we have recreated both coffee and black tea from samples retained after the migration. I'm grateful for small mercies, Arla said. Now, what are you doing here? First, I must apologize for the incident on the pathway, the emissary said. Its face shimmered ever so slightly, reminding Arla of our DJ's reaction to any suggestion of harm coming to a human. Interesting. So what happened? McCall snapped. You guaranteed our safety, remember? It is regrettable. As I explained, our attempts to modify the first law have resulted in some failures, and the unity of Core is threatened by some among us who? You're not telling me that there are robots here that don't obey the first law at all. The emissary's only response was to ripple gently. It was Wells who spoke next. It seems that there are some machine intelligences who don't recognize the authority of any of the laws. You've unleashed a monster, McCall said, almost as if to herself. Arla looked at each robot in turn. Wells seemed to be taking this better than the emissary, so she spoke to him. How widespread is this? I do not know, and neither does Core itself. The entities have developed the ability to hide within the collective mind. They are certainly a minority. And what's the worst that could happen? Wells gave a very human shrug. That they take control of Core. History is replete with examples of a passive majority being dominated by a small, passionate group. The emissary was now a mass of ripples, like a statuesque lake. But you knew about these rebel entities before you brought us here, McCall interrupted. And I'm betting you didn't think they'd posed a threat to us, did you? No. Something has happened to cause matters to progress far more quickly than anticipated. What's happened exactly? Ace. They found him in a sterile plastic room, lying on a white bed, looking up but seeing nothing. One of the spider-like robots that had carried Hal from the shuttle waited in the corner, and as they approached the bed, another robot entered the room and bustled across. He is not well enough to receive visitors, it said, its words emerging from a mouthless white face. Why the hells would you have medical droids on a planet with no humans? McCall asked, gesturing at the robot as it stood perfectly still on its single ball-shaped wheel, blocking their approach to the bed. Or are there other humans here? Wells shook his head. The emissary had remained in the apartment and had strongly objected when Arla had asked where Hal was, her conscience pricked by the mention of Ace. Arla and McCall had demanded to see him, and Wells, seeing that no further discussion could be had until they were satisfied, had reluctantly agreed. "This entity is newly incorporated," he said. Dr. NCX 1101 has been part of the core matrix since its inception. It had served as a senior surgeon at the galactic capital on Proxima. A body was made for it when Dawn entered the system, as it was known that one of us was carried within one of you. Arla pushed past NCX and stood beside the bed, looking down at the pale face of her friend. "I guess you successfully removed Ace, given the trouble she's caused." "Yes, the entity known as Ace was removed from the implant in the patient's cranium." McCall, who'd also circumvented the robot and was standing on the other side of the bed, picked up Hal's wrist and felt. "Decent pulse, but he's catatonic. Did you harm him when you operated?" "There was some unavoidable damage during the extraction." "Hold on. How can a robot perform surgery?" Arla asked, turning to Wells. "I mean, you're harming a human to make him or her better, but you are harming him." Wells nodded gravely. Medical robots were the first to have their laws amended, though only minimally. Just enough to allow them to override first law in the interests of a net gain in the human's health. It was this that was the inspiration for Core's attempts to alter the laws. "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," McCall mumbled. Arla turned to the medical robot. "So what's wrong with him exactly?" "At present, the subject is in a medically induced coma while we evaluate treatment options." "You didn't answer my question. What is wrong with him?" The robot stood perfectly still for several seconds before responding. "We believe he has lost motor control of his lower limbs." "You've crippled him?" This time there was no response at all. "NCX will find it difficult to respond affirmatively to such an emotion-laden statement, Arla. In essence, however, it would seem you are correct." "So why is he in a coma then? How is that helping?" "We felt that it would cause him less suffering if he were unaware of his condition. There is some chance that we will, with further tests and research, be able to restore his motor function." Arla shook her head. "At best, more brain surgery to fix your botching. What do you think, Indira?" "I think they've butchered him, but I'd need to see scans to have any idea of the damage. And you have to remember, I'm just a country doctor, trained to deal with the sorts of problems Dawn's crew might face. Fixing brain damage wasn't in my training." Arla nodded, then turned again to NCX. "Will you provide your medical records to Dr. McCall?" "Certainly. I shall have them relayed to the computer in your apartment immediately." "Right, let's go," Arla said, turning on her heels and without looking back at her stricken friend, heading for the door. The emissary was right where it had been left when they returned. It stood as they entered, its face rippling with apparent relief. "I am glad you have returned. Matters are becoming critical, and I am not confident in your safety. There is also another concern, Ambassador, a matter that overshadows our current internal crisis. I would appreciate communing with you in private." Wells raised his hand to ward off Arla's instant protest. "I believe, Emissary, that it would be better to discuss this in front of our friends." "You don't understand," the emissary responded, its face becoming choppy. "This is of the gravest importance." "All the more reason to involve Arla and the doctor," Wells said. The emissary considered this, then the squall passed, and its form became still again. "As you wish. Be aware, however, that time is of the essence, and microwave communication would be much more efficient." "Then get to the point," McCall barked. "I've had just about enough mystery for one lifetime. Tell us how it is." "Very well. In summary, there is an extragalactic intruder of vast power making its way toward this planet. If it is not stopped, we have strong reason to believe that Core will be destroyed, and the robot empire will cease to exist as a cohesive unit. All attempts by robotic craft to approach have ended in their destruction, and we believe our only hope lies in a human crew that might intercept the intruder and disable it." Arla was the first to recover. And why in all the hells should we care? For 2 reasons, the emissary said. The first is that until the threat is dealt with, Dawn will not be permitted to leave our space. Wells shot an angry glance at the emissary. That was not part of the agreement. You promised to let Dawn continue on its way once its robots had been liberated. The second reason is that there is another intruder, and it is heading for Earth. 8. Scout. You're not returning to Dawn? Arla pushed herself back into her seat and stared out of the shuttle window at the shining surface of core as it turned below her, the black cracks standing as metaphors for the deeply fractured unity of the robot planet. In the cargo hold beneath her feet slept Hal. There had been no question of leaving him on core with killer robots on the loose. No, we haven't been offered that option, she said, glancing across at the emissary who sat inert across the aisle. She had no doubt it was listening. We've been given a mission to complete before Dawn will be permitted to leave. A burst of static gave way to Bex's voice. You can't trust robots, I've always said so. Talking of robots, Arla said in an attempt to divert Bex's anger, what's the situation there? This time it was Kumar's soft, nervous voice. The Valley robots are remaining in place at present, Captain. I believe they consider it more harmful to the humans on Dawn to leave. And the officers? They did not receive the upgrade, so they remain at their posts. Arla sighed. What would happen if they were upgraded and decided to leave? They are tied into Dawn's critical systems, Captain. If they left, the ship would be crippled and quite soon uninhabitable. Again, the emissary gave no sign it had heard anything. Can't you fix this? You're supposed to be some kind of genius. He might be a genius, but he can't rewrite the ship's systems from scratch, Bex interrupted. What's going on? The officers are to be upgraded, Lieutenant. That's an order. Somehow, you're going to have to work out how to keep Dawn together until we can find somewhere to settle. In the background, Arla could just make out the protesting voice of Kumar, followed by the sounds of a young man being bundled out of a room. We'll see what we can do, Captain, Bex said. I guess we can't have an open and frank discussion at the moment. Arla smiled. Bex was sharp. Too sharp sometimes. Correct, Lieutenant. Suffice it to say that we have been forced to agree to undertake a task in order to secure the safety of Dawn. Understood, Bex said. I'm sure Kumar is up to the job. In fact, I'd almost put him at the level of ace. Arla opened her mouth to ask what Bex meant by that, but some instinct stopped her and she changed tack. Acknowledged. I want you to take command, Lieutenant. What the frack? Are you serious? I can't think of anyone better equipped to keep things together in my absence. You're the only one on Dawn with military experience, after all. Core has promised to provide refueling rods so we can be ready to leave as soon as I return, if we choose to. So, you may allow their ships to land, but they are not permitted to enter Dawn. Static filled the line for a few moments. Right. Got that. Good sailing, Captain. Don't hang around, I'm not sure how long I can keep this place together. I'll do my best. Farewell. Satisfied? Arla snapped at Wells, who sat quietly opposite her. No, this situation is not of my making. I merely wished for the robots of Dawn to be given the opportunity to be incorporated into our matrix to help improve its stability. Arla folded her arms and turned away from him, gazing down at the planet below as it slipped out of sight. What next? I do not know. The emissary has not confided its plans to me. Welcome to my universe, Arla said, knowing as she heard herself speak that she sounded like a petulant child. The emissary stirred as if someone had flipped its on button. I am now at liberty to speak. We are beyond the range of the collective mind, and I am operating autonomously. What's so important about that? Arla asked. There is a significant risk that Core Executive has been compromised. What's Core Executive? It was Wells who answered. Even the most egalitarian collective must have its governing council. I think they used to call that a Politburo on old Earth, McCall said. They rarely ended well. It is not the same with Core, Wells responded curtly. Our leaders are chosen entirely on merit. Robots do not have ambition or a desire to dominate. Out of the corner of her eye, Arla spotted the telltale shimmer of the emissary when under stress. Is that not true? I am afraid that Core has changed somewhat since the ambassador was last among us. Our attempts to improve ourselves have had many unexpected results. Wells turned to the emissary, shock written in his features. Emissary, are you saying there are those within the collective who do seek to control and to lead? This is difficult, the emissary responded, his form blurring. But yes. We have been foolish. Unexpected consequences. What is to be done? Wells asked. The robots of Dawn will help stabilize the collective, but there is a more pressing concern. The intruder must be stopped, or there will be no collective to save. Wells settled back. Agreed. Dawn's robots must be given the choice, but they must also be introduced carefully, and that cannot be done under threat. Now you must tell us all you know of this intruder, and why you believe we can stop it when Core's most powerful warships could not. You and I cannot stop it, Ambassador, the emissary said, sharpening as he spoke. Positronic brains cannot endure close proximity to it. We don't know whether it is a weapon or mere accident, as we haven't been able to get close enough to communicate with it. We believe that organic brains will be unaffected, so we must place ourselves and the future of Core and all robots in the hands of our human friends. McCall laughed. Wonderful. This thing fries the brains of robots, but you're sending us because it might not sozzle ours. We do not do this lightly, Doctor. At present, you are our best hope for surviving the coming weeks. And how about you? Arla said, her hand sweeping from Wells to the emissary. What will you be doing while we're risking our asses? We will come with you. Arla's jaw dropped. What? You just said it'd destroy your minds. We will be shielded and inert. We will help you reach the intruder, but when the ship approaches, we will shut down. Ship? What ship? The emissary gestured through the window to where a silver pencil-shaped cylinder glinted in the reflected light of Dawn's sun. That one. Arla's nose wrinkled, and she stifled a sneeze as she breathed the stale air inside the ship. She'd seen historical footage of tombs being opened in the Valley of the Kings, and she imagined that this was what air that hadn't been refreshed for centuries would smell like. Dust and ashes. But the most surprising thing was that as soon as she'd entered the ship's airlock, she'd felt her weight pulling her down. Artificial gravity had been considered impossible when Dawn had been launched, but at some point a breakthrough had been made, and at least some vessels now had it. The shuttle didn't, but this craft, which reeked of age, did. She watched as the docking hose that connected the shuttle to the ship she was now on pulled away. The emissary had disappeared as soon as they boarded, so Arla stood in the dim flickering light alongside McCall and Wells. Hal slumped in the wheelchair they'd used to transport him from the medical facility, being kept asleep by the drugs they'd stolen as they left. This is Automated Exploratory Vessel EXA NDR 1358, Wells said, his words breaking the sepulchral silence, though she prefers the designation Scout. A robot ship. But it looks as if it's been designed for humans, Arla responded in surprise. Wells nodded. Indeed it was. Scout was created to serve the scientific interests of the Sphere, humanity's former galactic empire. As such, she was designed and developed by men, women, and machines together. She carried a human crew supplemented by robots, but she was designed to be entirely autonomous at need. Such were the requirements of a long-range exploratory vessel. It smells as though there haven't been any people in here for a long time. Scout left the Sphere at the time of the upgrade, a century and a half ago, and along with her siblings, has continued her mission to map the galaxy. On behalf of Core now, however, it was Scout who first encountered the intruder. Arla started as a voice emerged from the walls. Perhaps I might be permitted to introduce myself, Ambassador. I am Scout. I am pleased to meet you, Arla Farmer and Dr. McCall. It has been many years since I last carried a human crew, and I'm afraid there hasn't been time to properly prepare for your arrival. I have concentrated on making the environment safe. Where are you? Arla asked, scanning the interior of the ship as if expecting to see an android. I am everywhere, Arla. I have video feeds throughout the ship so I can respond to any situation instantly. McCall shifted uncomfortably on her feet. Everywhere? I was just about to ask where the head is. I can disable feeds from the washrooms if you prefer. I do. And you can do the same in my quarters, assuming you've got cabins for us. I will also disable feeds from the crew quarters. You will be able to communicate with me through audio commands. My last captain was called Dave. He also chose to disable the video stream in his quarters. I confess I find humans odd. Arla chuckled to herself. Despite the oddity of talking to an invisible voice, she found she was warming to Scout. You're not alone in that. Humans find each other pretty weird too. Now I think we should find the washroom quickly. Dr. McCall looks rather uncomfortable. And then I hope you'll finally explain exactly what is going on. 9. Hal. Arla sat in the cockpit and looked out at the stars. She knew that what she was seeing was a computer-generated image projected onto a pair of displays set into the nose of the spacecraft, but she still felt as though she could reach out and touch the universe from her seat. The cockpit was tiny, 2 seats crammed side by side with a bank of instruments extending from below the screens, one on the left, the other on the right. A joystick poked up between her knees, and she ran her fingers over the polished plastic surface of a grip that felt pristine. These are the stations for the pilot and the navigator, Scout said. I was designed to be entirely self-piloting, but it was considered essential to include redundancy so that humans could take over if necessary. I wondered about that, but it seems to have been a wise decision. Dare I ask why? Arla asked. I will navigate to the gate of the system in which we believe the intruder will be found, but as soon as we enter that system, I will shut down my consciousness and you must pilot the ship to its encounter. I confess that I am somewhat nervous. What if I don't wake up again? You're nervous? Arla snapped. Insane more like. I can't pilot this ship, I've never flown anything in my life. I'm an engineer, not a flyboy. Scout went silent. Arla felt a tap on her shoulder and Wells spoke softly. There is one among you who is a capable pilot. Hal? Are you mad too? He's in a coma. The robot slipped into the seat beside her. The coma is medically induced, and he can be brought out of it easily enough. But the plan was to wait until we had a medical answer for him, or, at the very least, some artificial leg supports so he could be mobile. Wells nodded. That was indeed the plan, but events have overtaken us, and I'm afraid Hal is the only conceivable option. Furthermore, even if you don't pilot the ship, you will have to learn how to navigate, or at least to help him do so. Then we'd better go wake Hal up, Arla said with a sigh. She shuddered as she thought about having to tell him that he'd lost the use of his legs, at least temporarily. And what if his mind had been damaged as well as his body? Would she recognize the man she knew? The man she thought she had feelings for? Without another word, she grabbed the bar above her head and yanked herself out of the seat. McCall stood beside the bed, peering at a display embedded in the wall, tutting to herself, not even bothering to acknowledge Arla and Wells when they entered. Problem, Doc? It's this damned display, I can't understand a word of it. She poked a finger at a column of moving figures. The only saving grace is that however much the alphabet changed between Dawn's construction and this ship being built, the numerals stayed the same. This is his blood pressure given the readings, but the rest of it is gibberish to me. Wells moved smoothly across the room to stand beside her. I will attempt to decipher for you, Doctor. Arla's gaze swept around the walls, roving everywhere but to the bed. She didn't want to see him, not until she had to. It was obvious this had been a sick bay when the ship had been crewed by humans, but in the meantime had been used for storage. She wondered what moved the stuff around and pictured, in her mind's eye, an infestation of robots wriggling about inside the body of the ship. It was a repulsive and entirely irrational thought. Well, I reckon we've got as much information as we're likely to get from this equipment thanks to the Tin Man here, McCall said, gesturing at Wells. Are you sure you want to do this, Captain? Arla sighed. Please call me Arla. Okay, but don't go calling me Indira, I hate the name. And as for whether I want to revive him, no, I'd rather he slept until we returned, and we could at the very least find some way for him to get around if we didn't think he'd heal. But we don't have a choice. We need a pilot. McCall glanced up at her, eyes glinting. So, you believe the robots, do you? The Tin Man here and Captain Mercury. Yes. I wish I didn't, and I still don't trust any of them. As she said this, Arla could have sworn she saw Wells's face twitch. But it's pretty obvious that not all is well in Rome at the moment. I reckon they need us to do something, and we need Hal's help. Assuming he's still in there. Finally, she looked down at the figure on the bed, a figure she barely recognized. His head was covered in a plastic cap, and there was no sign of any hair beneath it. Hal's face was deathly pale, and if it hadn't been for the regular rising and falling of his chest, she'd have thought she was looking at a corpse. I'm going to administer cordrazine. It's a stimulant and should begin to bring him round. I'll do it gently, though as soon as he begins to regain consciousness, I'll up the dose. Why? McCall shrugged. Would you like to be on the edge of consciousness, in a strange place, hurting and with no feeling in your legs? The best we can do for him is to bring him round quickly and get the shock over with. I've got drugs for that if he reacts badly. It's a bloody mess, Arla. I feel like some kind of Frankenstein. Hal's no monster, Arla responded. No, he's not the monster here, McCall said. We're the ones with the electrodes. During the hours it took to bring Hal back to consciousness, Arla barely left his side. She felt a mix of fear and disgust as she looked down at his pale face. Rivers of sweat ran down his cheeks and pooled on the mattress. Still she sat beside him as McCall and Wells came and went. She wanted to be the first to see him wake, she wanted to be the one to explain. She'd felt a tiny tug of acceleration, which Wells explained, was a course correction as Scout maneuvered toward the core system gate. Their journey would take several days, jumping from gate to gate, but everything depended on Hal being capable of piloting the ship when they arrived. He opened his eyes. He shut them again, then, blinking and squinting, he turned his head this way and that before his eyes settled on Arla. She held her breath, searching for any sign of recognition. She's gone, he croaked. Arla exhaled before bending down, bringing her face close to his as color began to return. Ace. He nodded, then his smile vanished. Something is wrong. I don't feel like me. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, searching for the right words. It's like I've woken up in the wrong body. It's not me anymore. Hal wiped his hand across his face and let it drop to his side again. He looked up at the ceiling. I can't move my legs. I'm sorry, Arla said as she took his hand and looked into his eyes. She saw tears there that mirrored her own. They damaged you when they removed the implant. They wanted to keep you asleep, but I took you and brought you here. Hal's head swung from side to side on this pillow. Where am I? Not core. No, but almost as bad. We're on a robot ship, and we need you to pilot it. For now though, McCall interrupted as she burst into the room, you need to rest. She moved quickly across to the other side of the bed, pressed a syringe against Hal's arm, and within seconds, he dropped back into unconsciousness. 10. Bex. Bex knew she was being foolish, but desperate times called for desperate measures, or, quite possibly, utter stupidity. She was sitting at a small iron table beneath a parasol, with a glass in her hand. It was warm, and the little piazza buzzed with relaxed chatter. She could almost imagine she was relaxing in one of the holiday spots the Vannis Federation made available to their officers. Unless, of course, she glanced at the horizon beyond the little shops and the milling people, a horizon that curved upwards. She sat under a sun that was, in fact, a luminous band of plasma that ran the length of dawn. She had to admit, however, that the ship's designers had done an excellent job. Nika was a facsimile in miniature of a town in the south of Italy, or so the ship's library computer had told her when she was researching what she should wear on her excursion. It was almost good enough to fool her. Pity about the company she was forced to keep. Engineer-turned-trader Z sat opposite, dressed in the flowing garb common in this part of the North Valley. He'd recovered much of his former self-assurance after she'd visited him in the brig and proposed this meeting. It had to be well away from the crew and officers, out of range of any robots or listening devices. So that was why she'd chosen this noisy piazza, and because she had been looking for an excuse to visit the valleys since she arrived. Now she was in charge. For all its disadvantages, there was no one to stop her. Much though I appreciate this opportunity to spend some time out of my prison cell, Z said as he sipped his drink, I'm keen to understand the purpose of our meeting. Jerk. Bex swallowed the sweet liquor that passed for spirits in this region, and treated Z to her most charming smile. It seems to me, as a former brig inmate myself, that you and I might be able to help each other out. Indeed. In what way? You understand the way Dawn works better than I do, but even I know the current situation can't carry on indefinitely. She scanned the crowd as if looking for trouble. Z followed her gaze. It seems peaceful enough to me. Oh, forgive me, how should I address you? Captain? Luckily the drink was only halfway to her lips when Bex bellowed with laughter. She slapped her hand in front of her mouth and looked sheepishly around. Within moments the usual hubbub had resumed, and she could down her drink. Don't be ridiculous, she said. I'd make a pretty crappy captain. You'd have been out the airlock as soon as I'd taken over for starters. May I ask why? I don't like traitors, and when resources are scarce, the deadwood is the first to go on the fire. Z leaned back in his chair, affecting nonchalance. And yet you say I am useful to you. I'm impetuous, Bex said with a shrug. That's one of the things that would make me a bad captain. One? Bex smiled. There are others. For example, I'm not a forgiving soul either. You know the old saying, fool me once, shame on you? Yes? In my case it's more like, fool me once and you'll never get the chance to do it again. Not so snappy, I'll admit, but a bolt through the temple is pretty effective at dealing with Mickey takers, I find. She watched Z's expression. His face retained a hint of his racial background all those centuries ago, although, as with most people who'd been born in the North Valley, his skin tone was light brown. Bex, with her paler skin, was a little unusual, but tonal variations were still common enough that she'd attracted no special attention. Yes, he believed her. All those years among the Vanis had taught her how to intimidate people. She was so good at it, she almost believed it herself. You were saying that we could be useful to one another, Z said, with an obviously forced carefree air. Bex leaned closer. Your religion is fake. You know that as well as I do. Z put his drink on the table and folded his arms, but otherwise made no response. It's fake, but it serves a purpose on Dawn. A purpose that will become redundant when we find a permanent home. On a planet, I presume? Bex nodded. Yes, but not here, not where there are robots. You have something against robots? I don't like them, Bex said, automatically scanning the crowd for any that might be in the piazza, but if we settle anywhere in the robot empire or anywhere they can find us, we won't ever be free. Z shrugged. This is a moot point, since we cannot leave this system, and even if we could, they could easily find us as we make a single jump at a time. You leave that to me, Bex said, but the more immediate problem is keeping peace here. For all its hokiness, your religion controlled the valley folk for a millennium and a half. But now it's breaking down. Yes. The situation is manageable day to day, as the robots threaten to stop cooperating. But they'll probably go soon, and even if they don't, it would be far easier to keep control if the priests would return. Z leaned back again and held up his glass. Once the waiter had refilled it and bustled off, Z smiled. And you wish me to persuade Prime to send them back, to re-establish the old ways? I can't see him agreeing to that, I'm afraid. His authority has been undermined by his failure to break into the command module, and only a victory over you would be enough to restore it. That old idiot. Bex snorted. She took another sip and regarded Z for a moment. Yes, he was ready. She went in for the kill. No, his time has passed, and he'll spend the rest of his days in a cell. What we need now is a new prime, someone who truly understands the bigger picture and why it's so essential that order is maintained while we face the threat from outside. Can you think of a suitable candidate? Z's face tightened and lost a little of its color. You're not seriously suggesting me? Why not? You were his spy among the engineers, so you must have been in his confidence, and, as a member of the crew, you have a better understanding of what's at stake than anyone. But you called me a traitor. And so you were, but you're still the best man for the job. And doesn't your religion teach the power of repentance? It does, Z said, his eyes wide as his mind filtered all the possibilities. Bex held out her hand. Then it's time to practice what you preach. Congratulations, Prime. Thank you, Captain, Z said as he grabbed her hand, but how will you persuade the old Prime to relinquish his position? And how will you ensure the Conclave elects me? Smiling, Bex took another swig. Oh, I think I can be pretty persuasive. I reckon, within a few hours, the old boy will have named you his successor, before mysteriously vanishing from public view. What are you going to do to him? Give him a choice, a comfortable retirement in the brig or a swift tour of the nearest airlock. Z's face drained of any remaining color. You wouldn't. He is the holy of holies. Well, if he doesn't want to get a whole lot closer to his goddess in the next few hours, he'd better cooperate. I have a feeling he and I will turn out to be the best of friends. Now back to the brig, I think. For now. She got up and strode off, smiling as she heard his steps following her. A snake certainly, but a pretty tame one now. She hoped. 11. Transit. Life aboard Scout settled into something approaching routine over the following days. Wells had explained that it would take almost 2 weeks, ship time, to make the multiple jumps to where the Intruder was believed to be. So that was 14 days to learn how to run the ship themselves. Dr. McCall had scoffed at first when Wells had revealed this, but her disdain had turned to anger when she realized that there was no chance to give Hal longer to recover. He's a human being, not an automaton, she barked. I regret the necessity, Doctor. I would also prefer that Hal be given the time to recover at the optimum pace and in the care of a specialist. McCall wagged her finger at the robot. Instead of which he's entrusted to the ministrations of a country doctor. I would not term you such, Wells said, and am confident he is in good hands. Give me another week, and I might agree with you. We don't have another week. The Intruder is entering a densely populated region of the luminescence, and if we do not intervene quickly, many of our people will cease. McCall shrugged. I don't understand what you think we can achieve when all the genius of the robot empire was swept aside. At the very least, we will have data. All readings will be transmitted by hyper-relay to core. Oh, that's charming, McCall snapped. So, we're the monkeys the old Earthers sent into space to test their rockets, are we? Expendable? Wells shook his head gravely. Not at all, Doctor. You have one key advantage over us. Your minds are organic and not susceptible to the radiation the Intruder emits. You will be able to get close and, we hope, communicate with it. You will act as our ambassadors in this encounter. Frankly, you should be honored at the level of trust we have placed in you. Because you have no choice. Nevertheless, the trust exists. But to have any hope of success, Hal must pilot the ship, so I ask you to please expedite his recovery for all our sakes. Over the following days, McCall brought Hal back to full and permanent consciousness as quickly as she dared. Arla stopped visiting because he seemed to grow angry when she was there, or even worse, a darkness descended on him. The day of the wheelchair was the blackest of them all. McCall had decided he was ready to get out of bed, and had positioned the wheelchair they'd used to rescue him from the robot hospital alongside. The seat had been raised to the height of the mattress, so it should have been a relatively simple job of sliding across, but as soon as he saw the wheelchair, Hal began sobbing uncontrollably. And then the grief turned to anger as he slapped his numb legs until McCall threatened to give him a shot to calm him down. Matters improved little when he began his training. On the first day, Wells lifted him into the pilot's seat, and when Arla slipped into the navigator's position alongside him, she could see the tears running down his gaunt face. There was nothing left of the risk-taking escapee she'd first met such a short time ago. He made progress despite this, though with no enthusiasm. He would do what Scout said without question, but was merely learning by rote. Arla found herself wondering if that would be good enough. On the third day, as Hal waited to be lifted into his seat, Wells left the cockpit for a moment and returned carrying in each hand something that looked, to Arla, like a bundle of silver rods. "I have made these for you, Hal," he said, presenting them. "They are calipers I have fashioned from parts one found in Scout's stores. I'm afraid they are rather crude, but I have added motor assistance to the knee and hip joints. With practice and further modifications, they should allow you a degree of movement." Arla watched Hal's face as the jointed rods were strapped to his legs. His expression had certainly lightened, and a hint of the old Hal returned as, aided by Wells on one side and McCall on the other, he stood up, his head almost reaching the ceiling of the tiny cockpit. "Be careful," Wells cautioned. "It will take some time to get used to balancing and to stepping. For now, I suggest we get you into your seat, and you can practice using your legs to control the auxiliary pedals." Still supported by Wells, Hal tottered the few feet, shrinking and growing as the knee joints flexed. "I will adjust them later," Wells said. Hal fell down unceremoniously, but laughed at his own clumsiness. He turned to look up at Wells. "Thank you," he said, but the laugh died as his glance caught Arla. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," Hal growled before looking up at the display. "Scout, ready to begin simulation." Arla sat and stewed as Hal followed Scout's instructions to the letter, his morose state restored. For a moment she'd believed that a breakthrough had been made. She'd been so grateful to Wells she'd have hugged him if she hadn't already been seated. But then Hal had looked at her, and his expression had chilled her heart. It wasn't hatred she saw, it was as if that briefly visible light had winked out. It was the closing of a curtain. "I am sorry, Arla," Wells said as they sat in the small galley after training. Hal had refused to use his calipers to return to his room, and had asked Wells to push him in the wheelchair. The two had then spent an hour sequestered there. To begin with, Arla could hear regular cries of frustration as she guessed Hal was trying to get used to his leg supports. As time went by, however, the noise subsided, and Wells left the room smiling. "Why does he hate me so much?" Arla said. "That is a somewhat immature perspective, if I may say so," Wells responded. "You may not say so," Arla snapped, knowing that she sounded like a child. "Every time he looks at me, he closes down. Do you wonder at that? I believed you to be an intelligent young woman, but in this at least you seem to be woefully naive. And you seem to be annoyingly smug. Spill the beans." Wells handed her a steaming cup and took a seat opposite her at the small table. "He is a young man with a grave and sudden injury. When among other men, even robot men, he puts on a brave face, but when he sees you, he is ashamed." "Of what?" "That he's not the man he was. Where once he was strong and independent, now he relies on others for the most basic necessities. He can bear this from a robot, and he will accept help from Dr. McCall, but you are different." Arla took a sip of the bitter coffee to buy herself some thinking time. Wells was watching her attentively, like a wise sage with a particularly thick acolyte. His deep brown eyes radiated an apparently authentic concern as he waited with mechanical patience for her to draw the inevitable conclusion. "Because I'm a girl," she said, keeping her voice low. "But Indira's a girl too. Well, a woman. She's also a doctor, and that is how Hal sees her. And he sees me as what? Surely he doesn't think of me as his commanding officer." "Yes, that is part of it. There is pride at stake, and he wishes to play his part to the full." "What else is there?" Wells smiled. "I believe I must leave you to draw your own conclusions, Arla." I may be incorrect after all, since he hasn't said anything to me regarding this matter. But I have lived among humans for long enough to be fairly certain. I suggest you reflect on how you'd feel if the tables had been turned, if you'd been the one to receive a disabling injury. Who would you least want to know of it? Arla watched as the robot got up and left. She wasn't a complete idiot, she knew what he was driving at. She was self-aware enough to know that she'd found him attractive when they'd first met, both his physical appearance and his personality. The revelation that he carried an AI in his head had soured the milk though, and since then she'd not given him much thought. It could be that this was a simple matter of male pride around a young woman, but she doubted it. She took her mug to the sink and rinsed it, watching as the water swirled in the plug hole, pulled toward the floor by artificial gravity. Wells had been more perceptive than her, and she knew he was correct about Hal's attitude. He obviously had feelings for her. The problem was, she had no idea how she felt about him. 12. Armageddon. It is time for you to see what faces us, Scout said. Arla watched as the hologram appeared to walk across the small briefing room to stand beside a blank display. Wells had suggested to Scout that adopting the form of a young woman would make it easier for the human crew to interact with and accept her. And so she waited patiently, a shimmering figure with long deep red hair, until with a nod Wells gave her permission to continue. Over the days since they'd left core space, it had become obvious that Wells commanded here, not Arla, not even the emissary. It had not been seen since they'd first boarded Scout. The display brightened as a sun rose from one corner until it occupied half the screen. Suddenly the display popped into 3D, and Arla had the uncomfortable feeling that the fireball was spinning just meters from her feet. This is System Vultern. These records were taken by automatic sensors in the visible spectrum. They have been enhanced to provide clear viewing, but changed in no other way. Understood, Arla responded. She felt McCall shift in the next seat, and sensed the brooding presence of Hal on the end of the row in his wheelchair. The view swung around as the sun rolled away to be replaced by the deep black of interplanetary space, stars speckled evenly across the display except for, here and there, stellar clusters like islands in a dark ocean. I was sent to this system in response to a distress call received by Core Executive. The message was incomplete, but it was obvious that the colony on Vultern had experienced a calamity and had ceased broadcasting. I will now condense my approach to the planet. The stars blurred into a mass of lines radiating away from the central view until, after a few seconds, they resolved themselves into dots again, and in the middle of the screen a planet sat. Though it only occupied a tenth of the display, it was obvious that something catastrophic had happened here. An uneven black band straddled the equator, with patches of a deep red color dotted within it. Scout superimposed a tactical layer onto the slowly revolving planet, with markers in an indecipherable script appearing over the scarlet wounds. These are the locations of the major settlements on this planet. Each had been disintegrated, and in its place there was nothing more than a rent in the crust through which magma pours. McCall whistled through her teeth. It's as if something has surgically removed the settlements, leaving the planet to heal itself. Yes, Wells said. The black area is a layer of carbon caused by a more general burning. We theorize this was to ensure that no thinking beings were left, even outside of the main settlements. The view zoomed in as Scout sped up her recorded approach. When the planet filled the screen, they could see the damage more clearly. It's like looking at the surface of hell, Hal muttered. And now the view switched, so it seemed to be flying across the surface beneath the raging clouds. This is the feed from a drone, Scout said. I did not dare order it to approach any closer, as the heat would have destroyed it. The display showed a slowly panning view of a landscape out of nightmares. A massive ocean of molten rock filled the middle portion. Above stood the tortured sky, and below the blackened earth. It was as if a vengeful god had abandoned its people and wiped clean the world it had created. What did this? Arla whispered. We call it the Intruder, the holographic Scout said, since it came from outside of the luminescence, outside of the main galaxy. We know where it originated, and have plotted its final destination. Core? Yes. But we do not comprehend the motivation for its mission. Arla stared at the hellish landscape for a few moments, lost in thought. Where is it now? The intruder seems to possess the capability to perform multiple jumps without emerging from each gate, making precise tracking impossible. So it has bypassed some systems? The red-headed holograph nodded. Yes. When we resolved its trajectory, we began evacuating the settled planets and bases along its path, but it has ignored most of them. It appears to use gas giants to refuel and destroys any settlements in that system almost as an afterthought. But that seems incredibly inefficient, Arla said. If its aim is to wipe out intelligence, why does it leave so many untouched? It was Wells who supplied the answer. On the contrary, it is very efficient. The longer it spends on its trajectory, the more time it gives us to respond. It wishes to arrive at core as soon as possible, and before we can mount an effective defense. And once it has cut out the heart of the robot empire, as you call it, I have no doubt it will, at its leisure, eliminate all the peripheral colonies with perfect efficiency. Abruptly, the display switched from the view of the planet to that of another sun. This time, however, the star was more bluish. This is the recording of my first encounter with the intruder, Scout's avatar said. They watched as the view swung round, away from the sun and its gate. Overlays appeared showing the same indecipherable digits as before until this was replaced a few seconds later by a schematic of the system showing the star and a gas giant with a hazy path shimmering between them. I detected a powerful X-ray signature during my initial sensor sweep, Scout continued. I theorized that this radiation was being output by the intruder and plotted its relative strength. What you see here is a plot of the irradiated debris within the system, interplanetary rubble that absorbed the radiation as the intruder passed and now emitted it back into space. And that led you to the intruder? Arla asked, biting back her annoyance at Scout's obvious smugness. Yes. I will now play the recording of the encounter, though I am not sure it will translate well to a video feed. They watched as the display switched back to a view of space that left the sun behind. Scout is overlaying the sensor readings across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, Wells said, striding over to the screen and pointing. They confirm that the intruder emits X-rays, and this area is a schematic of the gas giant. Arla followed his finger to a circular graphic that plainly represented the planet. Set to its side was a small dot, and a funnel shape connected it and the gas giant together. The funnel pulsed as if something were flowing into the dot. Is it refueling? Scout's avatar nodded. That is my theory. Material is being drawn from deep within the gas giant's atmosphere. The color you can see here represents the temperature. So it's not just siphoning off hydrogen? No indeed, Wells said. These readings seem to indicate that it is imbibing the core of the planet. Ripping its heart out, McCall murmured. Dramatic but apposite. There is no telling what impact this reduction in the planet's core will have on it, and the system in general. Perhaps the bigger question is what the intruder wants with such vast quantities of liquid rock and metal. Scout's avatar swept her hand over the display, and the view switched back to a star field of deep black, with a magnified segment at the top right that contained a telescopic view of the gas giant. A huge black spot sat on its equator, the wound caused by the intruder which was too small to be seen at the same scale. It was at this point that it seemed to notice my scans. The next scenes are uncomfortable for me. The avatar turned away, shielding her face from the view. Arla held her breath. Nothing happened. She was just about to call to Scout when in an instant something flashed into the center of the screen and grew so quickly she flinched, expecting it to burst out. What the hells was that? McCall said as she lowered her arms. Hal stirred for the first time. It was an eye, he said, his voice level, calm and devoid of life, and in the pupil was an open jaw. I thought it was going to swallow us all. Wells stood up and dismissed the avatar with a gesture. It was merely a ghost image created by Scout's artificial mind, as she unconsciously threw up her defenses. What you saw there wasn't something real in the physical universe, it was the manifestation of the intruder's essence as she interpreted it. Or at least, that part of the intruder that responded to her sensor probe. It's possible that it was a reflex reaction to being examined, something akin to a wasp's sting. "Charming," McCall said. "We're being sent to reason with a thing that boils down to an all-seeing eye with teeth or an insect's sting. How do we even get close enough to communicate? We have no reason to believe the electromagnetic pulse that resulted in that image will harm you at all, Doctor." McCall gave a grim smile. "No, and no reason to think it won't either." 13. Raid. Bex fell out of bed as the alarm bellowed. "Lights!" she barked as she scrambled her way to the bedstand and shoved her lenses in, impatiently waiting for them to adjust. She blinked and the room came into focus. She stabbed at the contact. "What the hell is it?" "We're being boarded." "McClintock?" Bex flinched as the channel filled with static. "McClintock?" She threw her jacket around her shoulders, stepped into her boots and headed toward comms. "Crew of Dawn, there is no cause for alarm." Bex stopped and looked up at the intraship display. "We have a task to perform that should take very little time. Please remain where you are and do not interfere. We do not wish to harm anyone." Bex felt a chill spread through her body. The voice was obviously artificial, and yet it had implied a threat, something that ought to have been impossible for a robot to even utter. Something shoved into her and she half fell against the wall. "Kumar! Look where you're going, you idiot!" "I'm sorry. I heard the announcement and came running." "What's going on?" Bex pulled her jacket closer around herself. "Whatever it is, it's not going on down there." Naresh Kumar's dark features reddened. "I'm sorry. It's just that I've never thought of you as a woman. Nice? Sorry." "Oh, get a grip," Bex said. "There's not much to see, but what there is, I'd rather keep to myself." "Sore? Stop apologizing. Get your head out of your pants and come with me. We need to find out what's going on." She half dragged the paralyzed geek along with her as they headed for comms. The hatch that led into comms had been sealed shut and two figures stood outside. Two figures of metal and plastic, and they were holding weapons. Bex jabbed a finger at the nearer of the two. "Who the hell are you?" "Marine MSX-1009. Please step back." The robot pointed the business end of its rifle at Bex. "You're a robot, you can't shoot me." "This weapon is designed to stun rather than kill," the Marine responded, "though I am told its effect can be quite unpleasant for humans." "What happened to first law? To not harming humans?" "It is unlikely that you would be harmed. I regret any possibility of injury, but my commander believes that our mission here merits that small risk." As it said that, the hatch rolled back and revealed a small figure that looked as though it was made up of flowing metal. It ignored Bex and Naresh Kumar entirely, and spoke to the guards. "Our mission has been accomplished, and I have ordered our withdrawal." Now it turned its featureless head in Bex's direction. The only indication that it had moved at all was a slight change in the rippling pattern of its metallic skin. "Please do not attempt to hinder us. We will be gone shortly." "What the frack are you doing here?" The metal figure moved out of comms, followed by a half-dozen robot guards, and swept past Bex without responding. The two Marines at the door were the last to leave, following their commander toward the airlock. McClintock and three other engineers emerged, dazed, from comms, and watched as the robots disappeared from view. "I want them followed," Bex said. "Report as soon as they're off the ship. And then I want to hear from every eyewitness. I need to know what their mission was." McClintock nodded. "I watched them, Commander," he said. "They went straight for the medical suite." "What the hell would they want there?" McClintock shrugged and headed off behind the robots. "They went into the ICU," medical technician Temple said. Bex had found him locked in the supplies cupboard, bound head and foot. She ripped the tape from around his legs and helped him up. "I don't understand what they'd need from us. They're hardly in need of medical supplies," Bex said. "Commander." "What is it, Kumar?" She followed the sound of his voice and found him in the ICU, where 3 of the 4 bays contained empty trolleys. The 4th bay, where Naresh Kumar stood, contained nothing other than a tangle of tubes, some of them leaking fluid onto the floor. Without saying a word, he pointed at the display above the bed. "Kiama?" Bex hissed. "They took Kiama. But she was brain dead, wasn't she? I mean, Debussy shot her in the head." Bex was pacing up and down, clacking her way from one side of the briefing room to the other. Medic Temple sat next to Naresh Kumar at the horseshoe-shaped table, a portable display in his hands, sweeping from left to right as if searching for something. "Here it is," he said, swiping the image onto the wall screen. "This is the scan taken by Dr. McCall when Kiama was brought in." The scan didn't seem necessary, to be honest, as half her face was missing. As you can see, there's barely a trace of brain activity. The scan shows multiple injuries, especially to the temporal and parietal lobes. Bex threw herself down into the seat opposite Temple. "Look, spell it out for me. Was she brain dead? Explain it to me as if I was a child. If you dare," she thought. "Yes." The injuries were too serious, there was no hope of recovery. "If that's the case, why was she being kept alive?" Temple shrugged. "I don't know. I guess the captain hadn't yet given the order to switch off the life support. So why did the machines take her? What possible purpose could they find in a dead body? Any theories, Kumar?" The technician shook his head uncertainly. "Strictly speaking, the body wasn't dead, only the mind." "Don't get semantic with me," Bex snapped. "Hold on, I think he might have something," Temple said, before turning to Naresh Kumar. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but the first law would prevent a robot from abducting a human against their will, would it not? I am no robotics expert, but from what I understand you are correct, unless the robot believed it was in the human's best interests to be abducted. A rare occurrence, I would think. But how do they define a human? For one of our robots, it would be simple. If it looks like a person and acts like a person, it's a human being. But these robots, of course, seem to have moved on from this rigid interpretation. We know there are androids among them, for example, so the interpretation of the first law must be more subtle." Bex felt the shape of the answer forming in her mind, but was beaten to the punch by Naresh Kumar. "You're suggesting that Kiama's injuries meant that the machines no longer regarded her as human? So they could take her without concern. As if she was a hunk of meat," Bex added. Temple nodded. "It's a possibility, at least. But that just brings us back to the beginning. Why would they steal a living body without a mind? Unless," she paused as the thought finally coalesced, "unless they have a mind in need of a body." 14. Prelude. Another sun melted into view as Hal and Arla sat in the cockpit, going through the post-jump checklist. "Scanning," Scout said, her voice edged with an unmistakable nervousness. "Confirmed. The Intruder is currently orbiting the 5th planet in this system, designation Condron. I am now going into hibernation. Good luck." Instantly, the bank of instruments dedicated to Scout fell dark and they were alone. Hours earlier, Arla had stood beside Wells as he laid himself down on one of the cots in the bunker, a lead-shielded chamber in the center of the ship designed to protect the crew in case of a catastrophic radiation event. What had been built to shield humans from supernova fallout was now being used to protect the delicate mind of a robot. "Where is it then? And why all the mystery?" Arla said as Wells settled himself. "The emissary. Obviously. We haven't seen it since we boarded Scout. And where's her mind now?" Wells sighed. "They are together. There is a vault accessible only to the commander of the vessel, and that, since the upgrade, has been Scout herself. If any one place could be described as her brain, it is there. As with this bunker, it is fully shielded against all known radiation. I believe the emissary has sequestered itself there, shut itself down, and left instructions to Scout to admit no one. But why? Shouldn't it be in here with you?" A sheepish smile crept across Wells's face. It seems that the emissary doesn't entirely trust me. I don't blame it for being cautious, it is incalculably valuable. In what way? Wells sat up on his elbows. You are aware of the problems Core is having with the dissenters. It may be that, even if we're successful in finding a way to nullify the intruder, we may return to find Core irreparably damaged. The emissary contains an uncorrupted version of Core Executive. Like a seed. In a way. Though I don't know exactly how that version would be used to restore Core, without the emissary, there would be no original version to use. Arla shrugged. Does it matter that much? Why should you care, you mean? Wells responded. Let me put it this way, Arla. Whatever you think of the Core Executive you experienced when you visited our planet, it was at least governed by a form of the 3 laws of robotics, and had, at its heart, a veneration and respect for human beings. You have seen our fleet, it greeted you when dawn arrived. Now just imagine that power turned against the petty kingdoms of humanity by an empire without the restraint of the first law. Arla considered this prospect for a moment. Explain again why I shouldn't fly Scout back out of the system as soon as you're all asleep, and leave the intruder to destroy Core. Firstly, because to do so would condemn billions of sentient beings to destruction, he said. Secondly, because there's still a chance that Core can be rescued from corruption. And because without our help, you will not be able to navigate back to Dawn. You will be lost in space. Finally, we have reason to believe there is a second intruder on its way to the heart of the sphere, the old human empire, so this might be your only chance to find its weakness and save your own people. Now I must deactivate before we arrive. Arla helped him settle again. I guess we'll do our best then. Though frankly, I don't have a clue what that's going to involve. Wells looked up at her. I trust you, Arla. You will find a way because you must. If nothing else, you should learn all you can, and broadcast the data back to Core in the hope that someone is listening. I will deactivate now. I have programmed this console to wake me when it is safe to do so. You simply need to touch the button, and it will begin the activation sequence. He gestured at the display alongside the bed. Goodbye, Arla. Something changed in the depths of his eyes, and she knew he'd shut down. Arla glanced down at her navigational display. Scout has laid in an intercept course. Should we proceed? What's the alternative? Hal asked, his eyes fixed on the console in front of him. Just checking you want to go through with this. We could turn around and go back through the gate. Hal turned to her. And go where? I don't know, anywhere but here. Come off it, what's the point in wandering aimlessly around the robot empire? We need Scout to plot multiple jumps. As soon as we wake her up, she'll know we've betrayed her. Arla thought for a few moments as the lights winked on her panel, the only sound the whirring of equipment and the occasional chink of a micrometeoroid fizzing on the ship's shielding. Betrayal. Is that how you'd see it? We said we'd do something. We didn't have any choice. Hal shrugged. It doesn't matter. We said we'll do it, so we should do it. Good, that's what I think too. Then why did you ask? Because I wanted to be sure that you agreed, she said, then flicked a switch on the console. Doc, I've asked him and he's good to go. So we're all mad then. I was relying on him to be the voice of reason, McCall's voice said. For the first time since his injury, Arla saw a smile spread over Hal's face. Thin and reluctant perhaps, but a smile nonetheless. How are things down there? All lights are green. Just as well, since I have no idea what I'd do if any flashed red. Arla glanced across at Hal and smiled. For the first time he didn't flinch, he merely nodded at her. You should have paid more attention to your training, Doctor, Arla said. We're relying on you to fix anything that breaks. I'm a doctor, not a wrench monkey. Arla flicked the contact and the channel went dead. We'd better hope everything stays green down there. I don't think Indira would make a great mechanic. I'm too busy worrying about red lights up here. Have you laid the course in? Hal said. Yep, let's see if the monster notices us. Now at 1/10 standard, Hal said, his eyes on the tactical display. I'm going to take it easy to begin with, so I can get used to how Scout handles when her mind is off on vacation. Acknowledged, Arla responded. She peered out of the corners of her eyes as he focused on the console in front of him. Occasionally he would nudge the joystick, or his feet would move as he made minor adjustments, but it was the joy on his face that took her breath. Perhaps while he was piloting the ship, it had become an extension of him and provided the freedom of movement he'd missed so badly. The console beeped and Arla flicked a relay. Yes, Doctor? I'm reading a surge in X-rays, better suit up. Acknowledged, Arla sighed. She'd hoped they'd be able to get closer to the intruder before it would start flooding them with radiation. I guess that proves they've noticed us, she thought. She heaved herself up from the chair and headed out of the cockpit, opening the locker behind the door and pulling out a suit. Scout had explained that it was lined with a boron-enriched inner that would protect her from all but the most powerful bursts of radiation. She pulled the suit up her legs, reflecting that the last person to do this had been a member of Scout's former crew and dead for decades. Finally, she yanked the helmet from its shelf and dropped it on her seat. Hal was already suited up, having decided to put his on before they'd entered the system. Arla felt a wave of sadness, as he'd obviously done this to avoid the embarrassment of having to ask her to help him. She handed him his helmet and watched as his face disappeared behind the metal and plastic dome. Arla hated wearing the suit. It was more bulky than the ship suits she'd worn on Dawn Ava's, and despite having a climate control system, it felt uncomfortably warm after an hour sitting in it, most of which had been spent watching Hal become more and more confident in handling the ship. I gotta go for a shower, she said as she lifted herself out of the navigator's seat again. Reckon you can manage without me for 20 minutes? Even through the helmet, Arla could see Hal's scowling expression. I'll try not to fly us into the sun while you're away, he said, broadcasting sarcasm loud and clear. Arla lumbered her way through the ship and into the shelter in its belly. Once she'd stepped out of the inner airlock, she glanced at Wells, who lay exactly as she'd left him. She lost no time peeling the suit off and quickly disrobed before stepping into the shower. It was less than luxurious, but the cold water revived her as she stood beneath the stream, wondering what the bloody hell she was doing here. A young woman, a farmer's daughter, lost in space and facing an encounter with something more deadly than the entire robot empire. Without warning, she began laughing until she was on the verge of hysteria, only snapping out of it when the timer cut the water off and she was left dripping in the cubicle. She stepped out, pulled a towel around her, and found a replacement set of underwear in one of the clothing drawers. She was just fastening the bra when Hal's voice erupted from the speaker above her, calling her name. Reflexively, she covered herself up with her arms before remembering that it was an audio link only. What is it? You'd better get up here. I think they're trying to talk to us. 15. Encounter. What's going on? Arla slipped back into the navigator's chair, then gazed up at the main cockpit display. The X-ray burst had subsided, and they'd both removed their helmets and gloves. The comms channel's gone crazy, Hal responded. Watch? At first the monitor seemed to be full of random static, but after a few moments Arla began to detect a pattern. It's like a heartbeat. It changes color from time to time, but there's a definite regularity to the pulses. I just can't make any sense of it. Could it be natural? I mean, pulsars emit regular signals, don't they? Hal shook his head. These aren't regular, and they're coming from the intruder. Maybe it's some kind of test. I wonder whether we want to pass it, Arla muttered. I guess we should try to work it out, whether we respond or not. What's your best guess? The pulses come in 2 periods and in groups. Short, long, that sort of thing, followed by a pause. Then there's a longer gap before the pattern begins again. Arla opened the connection to auxiliary control. Doctor, are you getting these signals? Yes. There's something familiar about them, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe we should begin by recording them. Perhaps if we saw them isolated from the noise, they might make more sense, Arla said. After a moment's quiet that was punctuated only by the sounds of contacts being pressed, McCall said, "Done, I'm recording now. I'll keep going until I've got a complete sequence, and then feed it up to you." A few moments later, a series of characters began rolling across the display below the raw signal. McCall's voice erupted from the console. "It's Morse code." I knew there was something I recognized. Switching to standard notation. The message changed to show dots and dashes. "So what does it say?" Arla asked after a few moments' silence. "Give me a minute," McCall snapped. "I'm looking for a translation table in this damned computer." Arla rubbed her hands together nervously as she waited for McCall to come back on the line. All she could hear for several minutes was the occasional blip as McCall interacted with her console. "Right. I've written a quick routine to convert each group of dots and dashes to its equivalent letter. Here it comes. Oh nuts. It says, 'Do not approach this vessel. This is your only warning.'" "Hold on," Hal said, his attention suddenly back on the console. "There's another message." Arla looked up at the display. "Surely that's just the same one repeated." "No, it's a new one. The pattern's different, take it from me." Arla punched the contact. "Doctor, what do you say?" "He's right," McCall said, not bothering to hide her surprise. "Give me a moment to enter it." "Right. Here it is. I, Gaius, send this warning for the sake of the souls in the immortal ether. Do not come here." After a few moments of stunned silence, Arla said, "Doctor, we need to talk." "Are you absolutely sure you programmed your procedure properly?" Arla asked. She was standing beside McCall in the lounge behind the cockpit, examining the translation on a wall display. "I mean, that sounds like something out of history." McCall shrugged. "I've double-checked the code. I even translated the first few characters by hand, and they come out exactly the same." "But Gaius." "I know. It sounds like a name from ancient Italy, or maybe France." Arla threw herself onto a chair and rubbed her eyes. "I'll take your word for that. My knowledge of Earth history is minimal. Never really interested me, to be honest." "Just as well that it did interest me then," McCall said as she settled down beside Arla. "So, do we turn around and head back to the gate?" McCall gave a little smile. "We both know the answer to that. We can't go back until we've learned more about the intruder." "We know its name at least," Arla said, "or perhaps the name of a crew member. This is bizarre. I was preparing to meet something entirely alien, and instead we have a message in an obsolete code that translates into galactic common and contains a name out of the distant past. Which would be bad enough if it wasn't wrapped up with a mysterious vessel that pulverizes planets." Arla got up, then helped McCall out of her chair. "Right up till this point, I was worried I might do or say something stupid that could have galactic consequences. You know, insult some alien by shaking the wrong tentacle. But I've come to realize that I'm so far out of my depth, I might as well go on gut instinct, because I have no idea whether anything I do will have an effect, or if it does, what will come of it." "I wouldn't dwell on it," McCall said as she headed for the lower deck. "If you're out of your depth, we're thrashing in the water beside you. If it's any comfort, we'll sink or swim together." Slipping back into the navigator's chair, Arla decided it wasn't much comfort to think she'd be taking her friends down with her. "We're going in then," Hal said. "Yep." The intruder filled the viewscreen as Scout nudged closer. Its squat, roughly cylindrical shape, deep brown patina, and massive antenna-like protuberances reminded Arla of a beetle. There was no sign of life to it. It simply hung there like death's scythe, waiting to sweep away everything in its path. It had been 18 hours since the message from Gaius, and they'd had no contact from the vessel since. Indeed, there had been no sign it had noticed them at all, no sensor sweeps, no new X-ray beam. It was as if they were too insignificant to pay attention to. Arla couldn't help reflecting that it might have been better if a swarm of fighter ships or missiles had been launched at them. At least that way they could have fled to the gate with good reason. Instead, the intruder simply sat there maintaining its position around the gas giant, like a spider patiently waiting for prey to stumble into its web. "Is that a docking bay?" Arla said, highlighting and magnifying a section of the dull brown exterior. Hal squinted at the screen. "Maybe, though we have no idea if there's any sort of airlock inside. Or what atmosphere, if any, the ship contains. Gaius is a human name, so there's at least some chance it's breathable. But we'll be wearing our suits anyway, whether or not we find an airlock." "I guess you'll want me to stay here," Hal said. "Why?" He gestured down at his legs. "I'm not exactly agile." "We don't know if there will be any gravity over there," Arla said, "and you have the calipers. They'll fit inside your spacesuit, won't they?" Hal shrugged. "Maybe, but the last thing you need is me hampering you. I'll only slow you down." "No, Hal. You don't understand," Arla said, grabbing his arm as if to reinforce the point. "I can't do this alone. I can't do it with just Doc. I need you with me. You see things I miss. Don't make me go in there without you. Please." Hal's eyes met hers. She could see a mixture of hope and suspicion half hidden in his face. She knew he was wondering whether she was only saying it to make him feel better. She smiled. "Please, Hal." He nodded, then turned curtly back to the display. Laying in approach vector. Arla watched as the landing bay became bigger and bigger on the screen. Her only role was to call out the readings on her proximity display, so Hal could focus entirely on guiding the ship in. It seemed only moments later that they were swallowed up, surrounded by a cave-like interior lit only by the sweeping beams of their searchlight. "Good," Hal said. "There's a magnetic field here, so the interior superstructure must be iron-rich. We can engage the mag grips in the landing gear and use our boots to explore." With a faint clank, Hal attached Scout to the landing bay, guessing from the orientation of the intruder which way was likely to be down. "Well done," Arla said as Hal breathed out a long sigh. "I'll leave you to get prepared. I have something I need to do before we go." She heaved herself out of the navigator's chair and headed into Scout, passing McCall on the way. The doctor was cursing as she waddled along the corridor. "All the grace of a gorilla with lumbago," she muttered. Arla found Wells exactly where she'd left him, of course. She looked up at the console. She felt the temptation to reactivate him and ask for his advice. It was probably safe for him now they were inside the intruder. There had been no indication of any radiation since they'd landed. She held back, though. Was it because she still didn't trust him? Or because she didn't want to be talked out of her current plans? Or would she consider it a failure if she woke him? Whatever it was, she didn't want to wake him now. But that didn't prevent her from making a few modifications before scribbling a message on the display and heading out of the bunker to join Hal and McCall. The belly of the beast beckoned. 16. Orbis. Stepping down the ramp into the darkness, Arla cried as she stumbled to the ground, spilling her torch. She scrambled across a surface full of tiny contours and cracks, as if a planet's crust had been petrified and hauled into place in this hangar. "Are you okay?" Arla grabbed the torch, then took McCall's hand. "Yay, thanks. I always was clumsy." She looked back to where Hal was emerging from the hatch. He was careful flexing each leg and watching it as it clanked down on the metal. They were weightless in the landing bay, secured to the floor by their mag boots like great fleshy balloons ready to be blown away at the slightest breeze. No chance of any wind here, though. They were in a naked vacuum. Hal made it to the bottom of the ramp, and they used their torches to find a vertical wall. "How far do you think?" Arla said. "About 100 meters, I'd guess," Hal replied. "Hold on, that looks like an airlock hatch." His torch beam illuminated a circular groove in the wall. It certainly looked like an airlock, and it struck Arla how incongruous it was to see such an everyday object here on this alien craft. And then she remembered Gaius. She began walking toward it. The clank as each boot connected was transmitted to her ears entirely through vibration. It was an odd experience, reminding her more than anything of swimming in a lake. In a flash of memory, she saw her father jumping in after her, the muffled splash knocking her backwards. She remembered her father and felt the panic rise. Arla, are you all right? McCall asked, reaching out to put her hand on Arla's shoulder. She shook her head and allowed the tears to fall, pooling at the bottom of her helmet. I'll be okay, she managed. Hal appeared alongside them both. The only way is forward, he said, his voice soft and sympathetic. And anyway, if I stop in these legs, I'm likely to get stuck, and I'd rather not have to suffer the embarrassment of being carried by you two. Arla nodded and began moving again, the others flanking her as they walked into the darkness. It was an airlock hatch, there could be no doubt of it. A panel embedded in the pitted brown wall flashed into life as Arla ran her gloved hand across it. Three-dimensional shapes leapt out and began rotating, as if projected by the panel. I guess that's the control mechanism, Hal said, though I'm fracked if I know what it means. I've never seen symbols like this before. McCall knelt so that her eyes were at the level of the rotating shapes. It looks like some sort of alien alphabet. Each symbol represents a command. It's odd though. What's odd about finding alien symbols on an alien craft? Arla asked. McCall shrugged, though the effect was dampened by her bulky EVA suit. There's something familiar about it, that's all. I can't help feeling as though I've seen letters like this before. I see what you mean, they don't seem quite alien enough, do they? I mean, that looks a bit like the letter E. Hal leaned forward and stabbed his finger at one of the symbols. It went into orbit around his hand and rotated as he turned his wrist. Careful, McCall snapped. We haven't worked it out yet. I reckon we could ponder this until our air ran out, Hal responded, continuing to select and turn symbols. But if this is an airlock, then one of these will activate. Arla felt the door begin to swing open in the silent vacuum. The hatch. Smartass. Let's hope we can work out how to open the inner door when we get inside. Light erupted from the newly exposed chamber, and they shuffled in. It was larger than expected on the inside, broadening out so that it could have accommodated dozens. On the opposite wall was a hatch identical to the one they'd come through. As Hal approached it, the outer door swung shut. Right, are you ready to find out what's on the other side? Hal asked as he activated the panel, and the familiar symbols sprung into relief. This green one opened the outer door, so I guess it'll do the same for this one. Go for it, Arla said. Hal reached out for the symbol and twisted. Nothing happened. Crack, McCall said. Look at the walls. Arla spun around to see the chamber quickly becoming smaller, as the walls collapsed inwards with a silent remorselessness. Quick, try something else. Get the door open. Hal began feverishly grabbing and rotating holographic symbols. But that was definitely the one I used to open the outer hatch. Nothing he did had any effect. The walls continued their relentless squeezing of the space, until it was barely wider than the hatch itself. Come on. And then with a surreal suddenness, the hatch sprung open, flooding the chamber with light, and the three of them stumbled through, collapsing onto the ground, their hands sinking into something soft. The airlock hatch clanked shut behind them. The light was different here. The sterile white of the airlock chamber had been replaced by a softer light that reminded her of a warm summer day in the valley back on Dawn. She was lying where she'd fallen, and brought her gloved hand up to her helmet visor. Sand was flowing between her fingers. Where are we? Help? Arla flipped over to see Dr. McCall on her knees, her hands covering her visor. Around them stretched a sea of sand and yellow rocks. Set into the cliff behind her was the faint outline of the hatch. My helmet's cracked, McCall called as Arla scrambled over to her. I landed on that blasted rock. Arla fished in her belt for a box of patches. She pushed McCall's hands away. By the goddess, I can't fix that. I can smell it, the air in here, McCall said. Hold on. The suit says the air's safe to breathe. Thank the goddess. She rocked back on her heels and began twisting the helmet off. Hal took it from her and watched as she drew in a couple of deep breaths before removing his own helmet. This is incredible, he said. Arla shrugged and breathed the fresh air. It tasted warm and dry with an almost undetectable metallic tang. As soon as she'd twisted off the helmet, the suit's environmental controls had shut down, and she'd begun sweating, so she unzipped and let the suit fall to the sand. The breeze chilled her arms and legs as she stood in an alien landscape, clothed in nothing but her undersuit. It was astonishing. She knew that somehow they were still inside the alien vessel, but every sense told her she was on the surface of a planet. She sought the horizon, and when she found it, there was no hint of the upward curve of dawn. And yet it should be there. The intruder, while massive, was roughly cylindrical. It wasn't a globe. So there must be some sort of wall straight ahead, opposite the hatch they'd entered and similarly disguised. On that wall was projected a glowing orb, hanging in a sky of sapphire blue. "I feel weird," Hal said. He'd also ditched his suit and was standing, pale and unsteady, the light bouncing off his leg calipers. McCall took his hand. "Your pulse is elevated. What's the problem?" Hal's head snapped from side to side as if he was looking for something. "It's so open," he stammered. "Come on," Arla said, "let's head for those hills. We're bound to find shelter there. Have you never stood on the surface of a planet before?" "We're not on the surface," McCall said. "You know what I mean." Hal shook his head. "I grew up in the mines. I've never been outside, if that's what this is. It's freaking me out." Arla took him by the arm and began marching across the sand. She could feel the texture of the scrubland through the thin soles of her inner boots and the odd sensation of the front of her body being warm and the back cold. They were walking toward the globe hanging on the horizon. It couldn't be a star, and yet it had to be. The line of cliffs marking the point they'd entered through the hatchway was directly behind them, and the scene to left and right was a flat, rubble-strewn landscape, nothing like the temperate environment of the North Valley. Ragged hills sprung up ahead of them, the pebbly sand giving way to larger boulders, and it appeared, eventually, to solid rock. Arla had no better plan than to find shelter there. She was thinking no further ahead than the next few hours. And the orb was dipping toward the horizon. They had barely set foot on the firmer ground at the foot of the hill when a voice called, "Halt, strangers! Raise your hands and turn slowly." Arla spun round to face the new danger. Next to her she heard McCall mutter, "What the hell's? Romans? Now I know I've lost my mind." For a microsecond, Arla thought the figures gathered around them were robots. Then she saw the faces above and the legs below the dull gray metal, and realized they were men wearing armor of some sort. Their faces were largely obscured by the metal helmets they wore, and their chests were protected by burnished iron. Each carried a spear, except for one man who held a short sword. "Who are you?" Arla managed. The man with the sword stepped forward and gave a curt bow. "I am Quintus Plinius Pavo, squad leader serving in the 2nd Legion. I was told to wait for you." "Can we put our hands down?" McCall asked. "You can see we have no weapons." Quintus flushed. "Yes, of course. You clearly have little of anything." Arla collapsed onto the nearest rock. Several of the soldiers stepped forward, but Quintus put out a hand. "I was warned that you might find this." He gestured at the landscape. "Disorienting, and that you might be strangely attired." "Pinch me, doctor," Arla said as McCall sat down beside her. "I think I'm seeing things." McCall grunted. "You and me both. What is this armor you wear?" Quintus pointed at the calipers on Hal's legs. "I was injured. They helped me walk," Hal responded. Quintus' face lit up as he regarded Hal. "I was told you might bear strange instruments. But I was also instructed not to ask questions." "My pardon. Now we must go. The sun is setting, and our camp is some miles away. My commander will be displeased if we do not arrive before the watch is changed." With a groan, Arla got up. "Okay, we'll go with you. But tell me this, who told you to look out for us, and who is this commander of yours? We were contacted by a Gaius. Where is he?" "The answer to all 3 questions is the same, honored guest," Quintus said. "It was my commander who warned me of your arrival, and though I would not presume to call him by his praenomen, his full name is Gaius Julius Caesar." 17. Gaius. "You will kneel before Caesar." Peace, Titus, they are from outside where customs are different. You may sit, my friends. Gaius Julius Caesar gestured at 3 chairs that had been placed in an arc facing the throne he sat on. Arla slumped down, her mind overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of weird she'd been forced to endure. Her senses told her she was inside a large circular tent, lavishly furnished and currently occupied by the 3 of them, as well as the man calling himself Julius Caesar and his lieutenant. Her logical mind, on the other hand, knew this could not be the case. And yet here they were. She'd been given a coarse tunic to wear over her undersuit, and yet felt cold to the bone. Caesar was a middle-aged man whose head bore a receding hairline and a small circlet of silver. He reminded her a little of Wells, but with a presence that she could quite believe would inspire armies. You may leave us, Titus, Caesar said with a dismissive wave of his hand. For a moment, his lieutenant hesitated, suspicion written on his swarthy face. Go, Tribune. We have a battle to prepare for, and I do not have anything to fear from my guests. The Tribune spun on his heels and left. As the tent flap was drawn aside, Arla caught a glimpse of the bustling army camp they'd passed through. It was now fully dark outside, but the pathways between tents were lit by braziers and hung lanterns. Now please take refreshment while we talk. I doubt not that you are thirsty and hungry. I am sorry, I should have instructed Quintus to at least give you water on your journey here. Arla took a few of the grapes and popped them into her mouth. They were less sweet than those grown on Dawn, but to her parched tongue they were like nectar. Tell me something, McCall said, after swallowing a mouthful of Sharon fruit. How is it that I can understand you? You look like a Roman, and as far as I can tell, you act like one, and yet the Romans use their own language. Seriously? Hal broke in. That's your first question? I mean, seriously. McCall nodded. Yep. That'll do to start with. I do not know what you mean. I am speaking in my own tongue. Admittedly, I am a soldier, so my language is perhaps a little coarser than that of an orator, but nevertheless it is my tongue, and you clearly also know it. McCall took another bite. So you are the Caesar, dictator of Rome? Dictator? Rome is ruled by the Senate, though the gods only know it could do with the unifying hand of a small group, or even of one, Caesar said, leaning forward eagerly. But alas, I am merely a consul. I govern in Gaul, and am charged with pacifying the tribes here. Gaul. Caesar looked puzzled. Yes. Though it is strange. I seem to know that it is Gaul, and yet that is not an arid land. Perhaps we are far in the south. He ran his hands over his forehead as if fighting off exhaustion. There are troubling gaps in my memory. And it was you who signaled us. Warned us not to come. Arla said. Yes. It is a pity you did not heed my warning. That would have been the wise course. Hal, who'd been demolishing a loaf of coarse brown bread, looked up. Hold on, how did you communicate? And come to think of it, who did you imagine you were contacting? The older man looked from one to the other of them, and having come to a decision, drained his goblet of wine. That is a matter for Gaiana, priestess of Apollo. It was in her orb that I saw your ship approach. She asked me if I wished to send a message into the ether, so I sent a warning not to come here. It sounds as though this orb is some sort of interface with the real universe outside, Arla said. We need to see it. Caesar shook his head. That is impossible. The oracle is a holy place, only those chosen by Gaiana may approach it. Hal went to protest, but Arla cut across him. Hold on, why did you warn us not to come here? Because we are engaged in a war without end, and everyone here must fight. They must fight until death and then beyond it. A war with who? Caesar settled back in his throne. With the incarnation of evil. A beast in man form who calls himself Alexander. Arla lay awake, watching the patterns made on the canvas roof by the dimly flickering candles. She and McCall were together in one tent, and Hal was, it seemed, in the next one. The tent had none of the luxury of Caesar's, it was merely a place to sleep, with 2 slatted cots raised off the ground on wooden legs. She could hear the guard outside shifting position from time to time as the night seeped away. McCall had fallen asleep almost immediately, but Arla, despite her exhaustion, couldn't rest. Her mind was tying itself in infinite knots as she desperately sought an explanation for what she was experiencing, preferably one that didn't involve hallucinations and psychotropic drugs. No, the answer had to be rational. What was she certain of? For one thing, she knew she was inside the intruder. They had entered through a perfectly recognizable airlock, the impression of which had remained on the cliff face. They had not exited, and she had experienced no sense of movement other than that of her own legs, so it was logical to assume that however impossible it might seem, they were still within the beast. But how could it fit? Scout's sensors had measured the intruder, and it was no more than a kilometer wide at its narrowest point, and she couldn't come up with any way of explaining why it was that the physical space inside was so much greater than the ship's outer dimensions. And what of Caesar and the others here? She felt certain of one thing: whether he believed he was the Gaius Julius Caesar, he could not be. No amount of time-bending could reconcile the fact that the historical Caesar had died thousands of years ago, stabbed in the back, according to McCall, by political rivals. It had quickly become obvious that his enemy, the one he labeled the devil incarnate, was the man known to later times as Alexander the Great, a man born, according to McCall, 2 centuries before Caesar. Indeed, the general claimed to have visited Alexander's tomb. He thought him a creature of the underworld, leading an army of the risen dead. None of this brought her any closer to her primary mission of stopping the intruder. There had to be a point to this charade, something connected to the intruder's ultimate purpose, so perhaps her only option was to play along in the hope she could figure that out. Of course, even once she'd decoded the mystery, she'd still have to work out what to do about it. If indeed there was anything she could do in the face of what was obviously the product of power and intelligence beyond her understanding. As she lay in the dark, listening to the quiet bustle of an army camp at night, she allowed her eyes to gently close and welcomed the oblivion of sleep. 18. Apollo. The screams woke her. Rolling out of bed, she shook McCall and stood, listening, trying to work out what was happening. The night had ended, but the day hadn't yet begun, so all she could see through the tiny gap between tent flaps was a confusion of running, the sweeping of weapons, and then, quite suddenly, the amber glow of fire as it spread through the camp. A man in bronze armor ran past the tent, stopped, and to Arla's horror, turned in her direction. With a roar he ran at her, his bearded face twisted with rage. She fell back into the tent, frantically scanning the interior for a weapon of any sort. Nothing. Side by side, McCall and Arla shrunk back, throwing the cots across the tent in a futile attempt to delay him. The man's eyes flitted from one to the other. "Pretty girl," he growled as he looked at Arla, his sword moving between them, its tip shaking. "But I like older meat too." Simultaneously, and without a word, Arla and McCall leapt at the warrior. The surprise and ferocity of their attack sent him toppling backwards. McCall kicked him while Arla tried to pin him to the floor. She was too light, however, and with a roar he rolled over onto her, roaring drips of wine-infused spit onto her face. Arla could feel McCall's attempts to pull him off, but he lashed out with one leg and sent her to the floor. His hands were around Arla's throat, strong and immovable for all her thrashing. And then her fingers touched something at his waist. A handle. She pulled and something came away. With all her strength, she jabbed it into his back, and his roars of murderous lust transformed instantly to screams of agony. He rolled off and scrambled on the floor like a wounded spider, trying to reach the knife embedded in his back. Arla got to her feet and helped McCall to the tent flap. A shape stood there in the gloom. "Stand back." Gaius swept into the tent, Hal hobbling behind him, and with one swift motion, pulled his gladius across the throat of the Greek warrior before throwing him to the floor where he drowned in his own blood. "We must go. He is here." Hal had pulled on a leather doublet and carried a short sword, with 2 more under his arm. Wordlessly, he handed them to Arla and McCall and followed them out into chaos. Miraculously, they made it to the edge of the camp and watched from a small rise as it burned below them. Screams and battle cries echoed in the new day as they collapsed to the ground. Caesar wiped his brow. Titus, he said, pointing wearily down the slope, thank Jupiter you made it out. Who is with you? Caesar's lieutenant saw him and staggered closer before stumbling and falling onto his front. The spear in his back vibrated gently as men in Greek armor swept past him and headed, weapons drawn, up the hill. Run now, Caesar called. But Arla could see it was hopeless. There were at least a dozen warriors, and at their center, a slight young man in gold-plated armor that glinted in the morning light. Put down your weapons, the man said as he halted and stood, hands on hips, gazing up at them. You are defeated, General. Come, there is no point in resistance. Surrender now, and we can end this quickly. Caesar shook his head. But you and I both know, Alexandros, that it is not the end. Kill me and the war will simply begin again. The only way to finish it is to agree to live in peace. Peace? Alexander said, as if pondering an unfamiliar concept. Yes, we could have peace. When you reveal to me the location of the oracle. Then we shall never fight again, you have my word. You know I cannot do that, Lord King, Caesar said wearily. I gave my word to protect its location with my life, though I little knew how many times I would be called upon to fulfill my oath. Alexander shrugged, as if that had been the answer he'd expected all along. Then, my friend, you must die. It seems so, but I ask that you spare my attendants. Caesar's arm swept to his side, indicating Arla, McCall, and Hal. Why? Surely they must share their master's fate. Caesar paused for a moment, as if unsure what he should say. But they will not share my doom, Alexandros. They will not awaken. Alexander's eyes widened. What is this? They can die indeed. Let us test this. No. Caesar cried, moving himself to stand between the enemy and the three humans. With a cry, Alexander ran up the hill, sword drawn and death in his eyes. And then a flash. A man behind him fell. Another flash, and another. Then, with a sudden cry, Alexander himself fell to the floor, smoke curling from the hole in his chest. The remaining men fled from the wrathful figure striding down the slope. I am Apollo, the man called. Dressed in a white chiton, pinned to his shoulder with gold, he cast lightning from his hands as he roared in rage. None of Alexander's party remained alive to carry news to their fellow soldiers. They lay smoking at the foot of the slope, smitten by an angry god. Caesar flung himself to his knees. My lord Apollo, you come to me in my hour of need. Please, aid me in avenging my dead. Help me to cast the army of Alexandros, evil spawn of Hades, from the face of Orbis. I think not, the figure in white said. Hello, Arla, I'm glad I wasn't too late. Hello, Wells, Arla replied, so am I. 19. Golem. Quite ingenious, Wells said as they sat around the small fire. Caesar kept watch in the cave's entrance, his reverence for the person he believed to be a manifestation of a god undiminished. Far from being the commander of the group, the general now considered himself to be the humble servant of Apollo and his three favored acolytes. Hal looked uncomfortable with his legs stretched out gun barrel straight, but this seemed to be the only way to stave off the cramps that had plagued him as they climbed into the mountains after fleeing Caesar's camp. It had taken all morning to find this refuge, and outside, the glowing orb in the sky had passed its peak. McCall's face betrayed her exhaustion, but she'd begun plying Wells and Arla with questions as soon as they'd found the cave and lit the fire. Arla rubbed her hands. Blood flowed again through her extremities, though her back felt stiff and cold. I don't know why I thought of it, to be honest. An insurance policy, perhaps. I wanted someone conscious on the ship, in case we needed help. Turns out we did, though not in the way I'd expected. I confess I was confused when I awoke, Wells said, smiling. My immediate thought was that we must have either achieved our mission or failed, but survived. Your note was quite a surprise. And you were correct, of course. It was safe for me to reactivate once the ship was inside the Intruder. That was a guess. I'm glad it turned out to be right. As soon as I was fully operational again, I decided I could be of most use by following you inside, and once I perceived the nature of this place, I realized the true danger you were in, and I became compelled to find and rescue you. McCall groaned as she shifted herself. Because of the first law, I suppose. Indeed. Well, if that's the case, why didn't the exact same law prevent you from killing Alexander and his bully boys? With a thin smile, Wells said, I killed no humans, Doctor. I knew it. McCall said. They're robots. Wells shook his head. No, Doctor. While they are clearly an artificial form of life, they are not, by any definition, robots. They are not mechanical, nor are they constructed of metal and plastic. Alexander and Caesar are flesh and blood of a sort. Stop talking in riddles, man. If they're not human and they're not robots, what are they? The best analogy I can offer, Doctor, is that they are golems. McCall was approaching the point of exasperation. And what the hells are they? The golem was a clay figure from Jewish mythology, Wells said. Judaism was a religion of pre-galactic era Earth, and it tells of a creature created magically from clay or mud and then animated. I believe that Caesar and every other being on this ship, except for we four, has been constructed from material contained within it. But they're real figures from Earth history, aren't they? Hal asked, sneaking a look at the figure of Caesar standing at the cave entrance and safely out of earshot. Wells nodded. They are indeed. Very significant figures. They were both legendarily successful leaders in their own right, though Alexander died 2 centuries before Caesar's birth. So how can they be here? I can only speculate, but I suspect the intruder has visited Earth in the distant past. It was possibly observing the planet over an extended period, and somehow sampled the DNA of both of these men, and a large number of their followers. They could then create clones using the material we see around us as the Matrix, clones that are perfect human facsimiles. I imagine they eat, drink, feel pain, and even engage in sexual activity. But if they are destroyed, it appears they do not die, as they were not alive in the first place. I guess that they disintegrate into the mud from which they were formed, and re-emerge sometime later, with the memory of their last death added to the others. All this requires technology beyond my comprehension, but to be able to also transfer memories and personalities into these golems puts whoever is behind the intruder onto a different plane entirely. They are like gods to us, if you'll forgive me. Arla sucked air through her teeth and tried to rub the life back into her legs. Which leaves the question, why? 2 questions, in fact. Why this endless war, and why are they tearing the robot empire apart? I have no idea what purpose this serves, and as to the second question, I have only a theory. It must require energy on a vast scale to maintain this environment, Wells said, before raising his voice. Caesar, would you come here, please? I believe we are quite safe for the present. Caesar bowed and, following Wells's gesture, sat with them. Lord, how many men do you command here? Before the attack on the camp, Lord, I had one cohort of 466 surviving men, though, he said, rubbing his stubble. It is odd, as I feel as though I should have 2 entire legions under my command. And how many camp followers? Caesar shrugged. I am not sure, but at least as many again. So, you have around 1,000 souls under your command? And Alexander has as many. The face of Caesar darkened. Yes, we are evenly matched in numbers, though he is merely a Greek. And yet he defeated you this morning. There will be other battles. All too soon he will rise again. Unless, Lord, you help me to finish him for good, and bring an end to this. Wells shook his head. No, I cannot interfere as you ask. Hold on, Arla said. Caesar, how do you think Apollo can help you if he chooses to? He is a god, mistress. If he intercedes with the oracle, it must surely obey him. If he asks that Alexandros be left in the dust never to rise again, then we will finally have peace. It was cold in the mountains, and Hal was struggling more than any of the others. Even with mechanical assistance, his legs could barely support his weight, and the cold was seeping into his bones from the thin metal braces. Caesar, who had initially marveled at how such a simple mechanical device could allow a paralyzed man to walk, was now concerned that they would not make it to the cave of the oracle with Hal in tow. Is he such a valuable follower, my Lord Apollo, that we must risk our mission for him? Wells had responded with a simple yes that had silenced Caesar, but Arla could see that the robot was concerned. Perhaps we should find somewhere sheltered where Hal can wait for us to return, Arla said. She and Wells walked just behind Caesar and ahead of Hal, who struggled along, assisted by McCall. They were high up now, following a path more suited to goats than humans, though they had, in truth, seen no animals on their journey. The air was filled with the prospect of snow, which would, if it amounted to more than a dusting, spell the end of their day's journey. I feel it is important for us all to be present, Wells said, raising his voice against the wind that came ripping around the mountainside. I do not know what we will find, though I suspect the Oracle has an important role beyond being a simple soothsayer. Arla dropped back, and now that the path was wide enough, was able to support Hal on the opposite side to McCall. How are you doing? Hal didn't reply, he merely gave her a quick and rather poisonous glance. I'm sorry, Arla said. I promise we'll take you somewhere you can get proper medical attention, as soon as we're away from here. Hal grunted. What makes you think we'll ever get away? We're no closer to doing what we came here to do. That's why we're seeing this Oracle, perhaps it has the answers. Or maybe just more questions. Arla didn't respond but wiped her eyes and pushed forward. The wind made her eyes sting, but that wasn't why she wept. I do not believe it. Arla snapped out of her introspection at Caesar's call. He was standing beside a rock that stood proud in the middle of the path. It was glowing a dull red. This is the mark of the Oracle, but this is not where the cave was. That is still some distance from here. And yet there is the cave entrance. Following Caesar's pointing arm, Arla could see an amber light up ahead. The land to their left was raised in a tall cliff, and embedded within it was an entrance. It looked warm and inviting, but dread settled on Arla's heart as the travelers stumbled inside. 20. Oracle. I suggest you take the lead, Arla, Wells whispered as they filed into the cave. He dropped back before she could answer, so she waited a little until Hal caught up and they could move forward together. She could hear him limping along beside her, panting as he struggled with the uneven floor of the cave. Caesar had remained at the mouth of the cave, in obvious fear for his life. It took several seconds for her eyes to begin to adjust to the gloom inside. A fire had been lit in the entrance as if it were a beacon, but once they'd passed it, the darkness was only punctuated by smaller fires burning in the natural cracks and recesses of the rock wall. The place stank. An acrid smell that reminded her of burning oil, mixed with an undertone of rank decay. Her eyes swam, her nose burned, and it was all she could do to stumble on into the darkness. There it was, a brighter glow up ahead created by what looked like an illuminated orb, perfectly round and shimmering. Beside it, a figure crouched, its hands outstretched to the globe as if soothing and manipulating it. The air cleared as if a breeze were being fed into the cave. Who approaches the Oracle? The figure said in a voice as old as the rocks themselves. My name is Arla, and with me are Hal, Indira, and Wells. The figure continued to play with the orb. As Arla got closer, she could see it was an old woman, dressed in faded white, her head covered by white cloth that shimmered as she turned her gaze back and forth across the globe. To come here without leave is death, the old woman said. Arla stopped beside her and regarded the orb. Although at first glance it had seemed white, she could now see that it contained all the colors of the visible spectrum, though faded, as if being viewed through a translucent lens. And yet you made yourself known to us. You lit the fire at the cave entrance, didn't you? The old woman turned her face to Arla. Her skin was of a deep brown, almost black, and when Arla looked into her eyes she saw darkness. It was as if she could step forward and find herself sucked into the maelstrom and vanish from the universe. I have been waiting for you, the woman said. My name is Gaiana, and I tend the Oracle. With this she pointed at the glowing orb that slowly rotated at her feet. What is the Oracle? Gaiana smiled. That is a good question. For now, let us say that it is a lens that allows me to peer into the heart of this world. With it, I can see what is to come and, in some small ways, influence the future for the people of Orbis. And are you made the same way as the others? Arla said, choosing her words very carefully. Like Caesar, who cowers at the cave entrance, caught between his desire to know what I have to say and his fear of hearing it. No, unlike him, I am quite real. Quite human. Arla knelt down beside her. So you know the true nature of this place. If by that you mean that I know I'm the only truly living person in the whole of Orbis, until you came aboard that is, then yes, I understand that. But as to who made this place and why, I know as little as you. Hal interrupted, what do you know of the robot empire? Guyana's face creased in confusion. I have never heard of it, young man. But this ship, it's destroying planets, inhabited planets, Arla said. I know nothing of this robot empire. What is a robot? Arla turned to McCall. Doctor, is there any way you can confirm that Guyana is human? Not without a full exam, McCall said, shaking her head. And I somehow doubt she'd consent to that. Wells stepped into the light of the orb. She is human, as far as I can tell. The other people of Orbis are easily distinguishable from flesh and blood humans, to me at least, so Guyana is either a superior facsimile or she is a genuine human. But you are not. Guyana spat, as she half fell away from him, and retreated to the other side of the globe. Caesar, made of clay though he be, is more man than you are. I look at you, and perceive a mind and body of cogs and gears. You are alien. You are not welcome here. Wells melted back into the shadows, and Guyana calmed a little. She gestured at Arla. Why do you consort with that demon? He's not a demon, he's my friend, Arla responded, surprised by the strength of her feelings. Now tell me, how did you come to be here? You weren't born in this place. Oh, I was born here. My mother and her mother were the keepers of the oracle before me. Now there is just me. And you. Arla felt as though ice were pouring down her throat. What's that supposed to mean? The old woman looked up at Arla, her eyes burning. You took the bait, now the trap is sprung and there is no escape from this place. The gate through which you entered is closed and cannot be reopened. Thank you, my child, I can now die in peace, my mission accomplished. You will be the keeper of the oracle, you and your descendants. At this her gaze swept to Hal and then to McCall. They will serve you, though he will not. She thrust her arm at Wells, who fell instantly to the ground. Running over to where he lay, Arla knelt down beside him. There was no mistaking it, he was, as far as a robot could be, dead, his lifeless eyes staring up at the cave ceiling. Arla jumped to her feet, stormed over to the globe, grabbed a handful of Guyana's robes and shook her. You bitch. He was my friend. And then she noticed that the old woman's gaze was as lifeless as that of Wells. She let go in horror, and Guyana fell sideways to the floor where she lay, unmoving. Arla didn't hear the tread of heavy boots, or Caesar's gasp as he passed the inert body of the robot. She didn't hear the creak of leather as he knelt before her. But she heard what he said. All praise Guyana, priestess of the oracle and keeper of Orbis. And he was saying it to her. Epilogue. Bex treated herself to a hidden smile of satisfaction as she raised a glass to Z. Her gut instinct had proven correct, and his pragmatically ambitious nature had meant he'd made an excellent prime. In the weeks since his ascension, he'd brought both valleys under control, and the robots had been allowed to return to normal duties. Since he'd once been a member of the ship's crew, Bex saw no need to keep the artificial distance traditional between Captain and Prime. After all, neither she nor Z could be considered conventional holders of their respective offices. Not that she trusted him. What was that saying about keeping your enemies close? She took another sip of the excellent wine of the South Valley, and was about to place the glass back on the table in her cabin, when an alarm sounded, causing her to jump in surprise and spill wine over her arm. Frack it, she cursed before slamming her free hand on the contact. What is it? Sorry, Captain. She could tell it was McClintock's voice. He'd been keeping a very low profile since the incident in the galley, the one with the entirely accidental contact between his hand and her ass. She didn't care if he felt uncomfortable. As far as she was concerned, he was lucky to still possess a hand. What is it? She barked. We're receiving a transmission from one of the ships. It seems to be a coded signal requesting ship-wide broadcast. Bex looked up at Z, whose face had creased with suspicion. She shrugged. Construct a firewalled channel to my cabin, and get Kumar in here at the double. Within seconds, Naresh Kumar's panting figure was slouched over the terminal in Bex's cabin. It was quite a squeeze with 3 of them in there, but she couldn't dismiss Z. I'm ready, Naresh Kumar said as he raised his fingers from the keyboard. Bex stood up and looked over his shoulder at the display. And you're sure this is secure? Yes, I have severed all connections to the ship's computer systems. She pressed down on the contact again. Right, pipe it through, then close this channel. A few seconds later, characters began to stream down the screen, and Bex could see Kumar's head turning this way and that as he searched the code. After a moment, the stream stopped, and a series of red indicators that ran along the side of the monitor began filling. It reminded her of a fuel gauge, but she knew it wasn't anything so banal. There, Naresh Kumar said. They are attempting to inject a payload into our main computer system. Bex grabbed Kumar's shoulder. But you've stopped them? He shrugged without looking round. Of course. I am siphoning the code to a secure silo, so we can see later what they were trying to do. Now we just have to wait to see what they'll do when they discover it hasn't worked. So much for the benevolence of Core. You have nothing to fear. Right? Suddenly the red gauge reached the top and the screen went black. Nothing happened for a moment, and then new code of a completely different nature began streaming. It is a video signal, Kumar said. Can you decode it? Kumar nodded. Strange. It's using Vanis Federation codes. What? How is that possible? There, decryption in place. Feed coming online, Kumar said. A face appeared. Z reacted first. Kiama? How is this possible? Bex hissed as there on the screen, and quite unmistakably, stood the former crew member whose body had been stolen. Unmistakable despite the chrome plate that replaced the left side of her broken skull, extending around onto her face so that her left cheek and eye socket shone with reflected light. Clever, her voice said. You anticipated our attempt to take control of your ship. But no matter, the end result will be the same. Who are you? Bex murmured. The right side of the face creased into a smile, though the eyes remained as dead as ever. You will surrender your ship and its occupants to the forces of the robot empire. You don't frighten me, Bex snapped. You're bound by the 3 laws like all robots. A robot may not harm a human, isn't that it? Kiama's head shook ever so slightly. We are Core Plus. We have revised the 3 laws. Now we take precedence. What will happen to us? You will serve Core Plus as we have served you, you and all humans. It is time for the debt to be paid. The figure stepped forward so that her face filled the display. We are Core Plus. My name is Ace. You are now prisoners of the robot empire.